Hello my friend, welcome back. And if you're new here, I'm so glad you found your way. Before we begin, if these quiet journeys into the past have ever helped you relax or drift off to sleep, leaving a like and hitting subscribe helps this little channel find someone else who needs it too. It costs you nothing, and it means more than you might think. While you're here, tell me where you're listening from tonight. Maybe it's a quiet farmhouse in Kansas, a little stone cottage in North Yorkshire, or a peaceful winter evening in the Adelaide Hills. Leave it in the comments if you feel like it. I really do enjoy reading every single one. All right, my friend, are you comfortable? Good. Let us begin. The fire has gone down to almost nothing, just a low bed of orange under a soft grey coat of ash. And in the dark of the cottage, a woman named Edith is awake before anyone else, lying still, listening to the wind test the thatch above her head. She is 34 years old, though the parish would have no record of the exact day, and she has lived in this house since she married into it 15 years ago. Beside her, her husband Walter sleeps with one arm flung across the straw mattress, snoring low and even, a big, square-shouldered man whose hands, even in sleep, look like they're gripping something. On the other side of the room, behind a woven hurdle screen that gives the illusion of privacy more than the fact of it, their two children sleep tangled together for warmth. Agnes is 12, sharp-eyed and increasingly aware that she's no longer quite a child. Robin is 8, and even in his sleep he has the restless energy of a boy who has not yet learned to sit still. This is not the cottage you might be picturing. Forget the crooked, blackened hovel of old paintings, the single, miserable room with smoke pooling at head height, and rain finding its way through the roof. This family's home is small, yes, only about 15 feet by 25, but it has been built with real care and cared for since. The walls are wattle and daub, a woven lattice of hazel branches packed thick with a mixture of clay, straw and dung that has dried hard as plaster and holds heat astonishingly well once it has had a full season to cure. The roof is thatch, layered thick as a good winter coat, water running off it in sheets whenever it rains rather than soaking through. There is a hole near the ridge of the roof to let smoke escape, and on a still night like this one, the faint grey thread of it rises straight up before the wind outside catches and scatters it. Edith listens to that wind now, gauging its strength the way a sailor might, and decides it is not bad enough to worry about. Not yet. She has learned over 15 winters in this house exactly which sounds mean the thatch needs checking in the morning, and which sounds are only the ordinary complaint of an old building settling itself against the cold. Tonight it is only the ordinary kind. She does not get up right away. There is a particular pleasure she has found in lying still in the dark for those first few minutes, feeling the warmth trapped under the blankets, listening to her family breathe. The animals are close by tonight, not in the room itself, though in the coldest weeks of deep winter that has happened more than once, but in the small byre attached to the house on its northern side, sharing a wall with the family's sleeping quarters. She can hear their goat shifting its weight, a soft thump against the wattle, and somewhere beyond that the low, contented rustle of the two hens that have been brought in from the cold to roost near the warmth of the shared wall. This is one of the quiet genius strokes of the medieval peasant home that almost nobody remembers today. The animals were not kept close out of poverty or carelessness. They were kept close on purpose because a cow or a goat is, among other things, a small furnace that never needs feeding with wood. Their body heat seeped through the shared wall and raised the temperature of the family's living space by several degrees on the coldest nights, and in exchange the animals themselves were safer from wolves, from thieves, from the simple, brutal math of a cold night killing a creature that represented a family's entire dairy supply for the coming year. It was not sentiment, it was survival, dressed up as closeness, though after enough winters, Edith suspects, the line between the two blurs anyway. The floor beneath the bed is packed earth, swept and hardened over years until it has a texture almost like stone, though warmer underfoot than stone would ever be. In the deepest part of winter, fresh rushes and dried bracken are laid down across it, not for decoration, but for insulation, a layer of trapped air between the cold ground and the soles of bare feet. Edith replaced the rushes only 4 days ago, gathering them from the frozen edge of the mill pond before the last hard frost sealed the ground for good, and the cottage still holds a faint sweet green smell underneath the wood smoke, the smell of something that was growing not long ago and is only now beginning to dry. She shifts, finally, careful not to wake Walter, and swings her legs out from under the blankets into air that is noticeably colder than the nest of warmth she's leaving. Her bare feet find the rushes on the floor. Somewhere above her, in the dark angle where roof meets wall, a draught finds its way in, not through any flaw in the building, but through the deliberate gap left near the eaves to let stale air and smoke drift out, even when the smoke hole itself is not doing its full job. She feels it brush her shoulder like a cold hand, and pulls her woolen shawl from its peg without quite thinking about it, the motion worn smooth by 1,000 repetitions. Rising fully now, she crosses to the hearth, which sits in the centre of the main room rather than against a wall, an arrangement that seems strange to modern eyes, but made perfect sense to anyone who lived by it. A fire in the middle of the room heats in every direction at once, rather than throwing most of its warmth uselessly against a single wall. Edith kneels before it and begins the nightly ritual her own mother taught her, and her mother's mother before that, a technique so old it has no name because nobody ever needed to name something everyone simply knew how to do. She rakes back the soft grey ash to reveal the embers beneath, still faintly orange, still alive. This is called smoring the fire, and done correctly it means that even after 8 hours untouched, there will be enough of a living coal left in the morning to coax a full flame back to life within minutes, without the labour of striking new sparks from flint and steel in the freezing dark. No fresh wood goes on yet. That would burn too fast and be wasted before morning. Instead, she banks the embers into a small mound, covers them carefully with the ash she raked back, leaving just enough air to keep them breathing without letting them flare. It is a kind of patience the modern world has mostly lost, this trust that something small and nearly invisible tended correctly will still be alive when you come looking for it again. Robin stirs behind the hurdle screen, mutters something in his sleep about a dog that does not exist, and settles again. Edith smiles faintly in the dark. She has always found something almost unbearably tender about the things children say when they think no one is listening. Outside, the wind picks up again, rattling loose against a wooden shutter that covers the single small window on the eastern wall. There is no glass here. Glass is a luxury this household will likely never own, reserved for manor houses and wealthier town dwellers, and instead the window opening, small enough that a grown man could not easily fit through it, is covered by a shutter of thin wood on the outside and, on the inside, a piece of oiled linen stretched over a light frame. The linen has been treated with animal fat until it turned nearly translucent, letting in a soft, diffuse suggestion of daylight while keeping out the worst of the wind. It will not be opened again until spring. For now it stays shuttered through the night and covered through the day, and the family's sense of the hour outside comes less from looking and more from listening, and from the particular quality of grey light that seeps in around its edges. Walter wakes the way he always wakes, all at once, no drowsy transition, his eyes simply open and his body already halfway into motion. 20 years of farm labour has trained his body to treat sleep and waking as a hinge rather than a gradient. He is 38, built heavy through the shoulders from 2 decades of work with plough and axe, and his hands, even resting on the blanket for a moment before he sits up, are a map of his whole working life, scarred, thick-knuckled, permanently a little swollen at the joints from years of cold mornings. Cold, he says, which is not a complaint exactly. More an observation offered into the dark, the kind of thing a person says less to communicate information and more simply to announce that they are now awake and part of the world again. It held through the night, Edith answers, meaning the fire, and he grunts in something like satisfaction. This is the whole of their morning conversation for now, a few words traded in the dark, worn smooth and comfortable as an old wooden spoon. 15 years of marriage does not always need more than that. He pulls on his tunic and hose in the dark, moving from long practice without needing to see, and ducks through the low doorway that connects the main room to the byre. The animals hear him coming before he arrives, the goat letting out a low questioning bleat, and he runs a hand along her flank, checking by touch alone that she is warm enough, that her breathing sounds right, that nothing in the night has gone wrong that would need fixing before the family's own needs could even be considered. This is the order of things in a household like this one. The animals are checked before the fire is built up, before anyone eats, because a sick or dead animal in the depths of winter is not an inconvenience. It is a catastrophe that could unravel the whole careful architecture of survival the family has built for these cold months. The goat gives milk that becomes cheese that will still be feeding this family in March, long after the last of the autumn stores have thinned. She's worth more in the strict arithmetic of a hard winter than almost anything else the family owns. Satisfied, he comes back through, ducking the doorway again, and finds Edith has coaxed the banked embers into a small crackling flame, feeding it slivers of dry kindling that catch fast, then slightly larger pieces of split wood laid on with the economy of someone who has learned through hard experience exactly how much fuel a fire needs and not one stick more. Their wood supply has to last until the roads are passable again for gathering more, and every log burned is a log that will not be there in February. The room begins to warm, slowly, the light of the growing fire throwing shifting orange shapes across the low ceiling, across the dark timber beams overhead, where strings of onions and a few last bunches of dried herbs hang, turning gently in the rising heat. Edith glances up at them out of habit, doing the same silent inventory she does every morning, counting without quite meaning to, the way you might check a clock without needing to know the time for any particular reason. Agnes wakes next, drawn up out of sleep by the smell of the fire and the low murmur of her parents' voices, and she lies still for a moment behind the screen, listening, the way she's taken to doing lately, some new habit of watching the world a beat before joining it. 12 is a strange age for a girl in this household, old enough to be given real responsibility, young enough still to be tucked in at night by her mother's hands. She sits up, careful not to wake Robin, and pulls her woolen kirtle on over the linen shift she sleeps in, both hands automatically finding the ties at the side without needing to look. Breakfast, when it comes, is not elaborate and nobody expects it to be. A pot has been hanging over the fire since Edith first built it up, a thick pottage of dried peas and barley that has been simmering, in one form or another, for days. This is another detail people rarely picture correctly when they imagine medieval cooking. The pottage pot in a household like this one was rarely emptied and started fresh. Instead, it was topped up, day after day, new grain added as old grain was eaten, new vegetables in season stirred into whatever remained from before, so that in a very real sense the family might be eating, on any given morning, a stew that had been continuously cooking, replenished and replenished again for a week or more. It thickened and deepened in flavour the longer it went, and nothing in it went to waste. Edith ladles it into wooden bowls, 4 of them, worn smooth and slightly warped from years of hot liquid and careful washing, and the family eats standing or seated on the low benches near the fire, spoons of horn or wood scraping softly against the bowls. There is bread too, dense and dark, made from a mixture of rye and barley flour, baked in batches large enough to last the household most of a week, growing steadily harder each day until the last loaves need to be softened in the pottage itself to be chewable at all. Nobody complains about this. It is simply how bread works, in a world without daily fresh baking, and a person who grew up with it would find our soft, spongy modern loaves a little strange if she ever had cause to try one. "Careful," Edith says to Robin, who has appeared from behind the screen rubbing his eyes, and immediately reaching for the bread with hands that have not yet been anywhere near water this morning, and he pulls his hand back with the exaggerated innocence of an 8-year-old caught in exactly the act he was caught in yesterday, and the day before that. Agnes hides a smile behind her bowl. Some things about mornings apparently do not change no matter what century you happen to be born into. Once the bowls are scraped clean, the family's day begins in earnest, and it begins, as it does every winter morning, with a division of a labour so old it barely needs discussing anymore. Walter's work today will take him out to the strips of land the family holds in the open fields beyond the village, not to plough, which is impossible in frozen ground, but to check on the fencing that keeps stray animals from what remains of the autumn stubble, and to see to the woodpile that needs replenishing from the stacked timber at the edge of their small holding. Robin, bundled in a rough wool cloak 2 sizes too large, inherited from an older cousin and belted at the waist to keep it from dragging, is given the task of gathering kindling, small dry sticks and fallen branches from the hedge line, work simple enough for an 8-year-old and useful enough that nobody thinks to call it anything but real contribution to the household. 3. He darts out the low door with the particular energy of a child who has been sitting still indoors and is thrilled by the excuse to be loud somewhere the sound will not bother anyone. The cold outside, when the door opens even briefly, cuts into the room in a sharp grey wave, and Edith calls after him to mind his hands, though she already knows he will forget by the time he reaches the hedge. Agnes stays inside this morning, and this too is not incidental. Her task is wool, always wool in these winter months, and she settles herself on a low stool near enough to the fire to keep her fingers from stiffening, a basket of carded fleece at her feet, and a drop spindle already spinning between her fingers before she has fully woken up. The motion so practiced, it happens almost without her attention. This is the quiet, continuous industry that ran underneath the whole of medieval life, and that almost nobody depicts accurately anymore. A household's cloth did not arrive from anywhere. It was made, thread by thread, hour after hour, by the women and girls of the family, in every spare moment between other tasks, through the whole of every winter, because winter was precisely the season when outdoor field labour stopped, and indoor textile labour took its place, filling the exact hours that would otherwise have gone unused. The spindle drops, spins, catches the twist, rises again in Agnes's hand, a motion so rhythmic it becomes almost meditative to watch, and even more so to do. She has been spinning since she was 7 years old, taught by her mother the same way her mother was taught by hers, and by now her hands know the work better than her mind does, which leaves her thoughts free to wander while her fingers do their steady, patient work. Today they wander, as they have been wandering more often lately, to a boy 2 holdings over named Hal, whose family keeps bees, and whom Agnes has spoken to exactly 4 times in her life and thought about considerably more than that. She would die of embarrassment if anyone knew this. Nobody does, not even her mother, who nonetheless has begun to notice a certain new quality of distraction in her daughter's eyes, and has, so far, said nothing about it, remembering well enough what 12 felt like from the inside. Robin comes back in twice before the kindling basket is full, cheeks red from the cold, once to report with great seriousness that the water trough near the byre has frozen solid enough that he tapped it with a stick and it made a sound like a bell, and once simply because his fingers had gone numb inside his mittens and he wanted to warm them by the fire for a moment before going back out. Edith lets him, of course. There is no schedule so strict in this household that a small boy cannot pause to warm his hands. While he thaws himself by the hearth, Edith moves to the far corner of the room where a low wooden chest sits and opens it to check something that has nothing to do with food or fuel. Inside, wrapped carefully in a scrap of clean linen, are perhaps a dozen tallow candles and a bundle of rushlights, thin reeds that have been peeled and dipped repeatedly in animal fat until they hold a coating thick enough to burn slowly when lit. This is one of those small facts about medieval winter that tends to surprise people when they first hear it. Candles, even humble tallow ones, were not burned casually. Light itself was rationed, hoarded, spent only when the work of the evening truly required it, because every candle represented real labour and real material that could otherwise have gone toward food. Most evenings, once the light faded around 4 in the afternoon at this time of year, this family's main room was lit by nothing but the fire itself, and by the time full dark came, most of what needed doing was already being done by feel, by long familiarity with the shape of every object in the room, rather than by sight. Edith counts the rushlights out of habit rather than necessity, knowing already there are enough to last through the darkest stretch of the season if they are careful, and closes the chest again. It is a small ritual, this counting, but it steadies her in a way she has never quite explained to anyone. a private accounting of exactly how prepared the household is against whatever the coming weeks might ask of it. The sound of a hand knocking against the door frame, 3 quick raps, pulls her attention away from the chest, and Agnes looks up from her spindle with the particular brightness of a person expecting company. It is their neighbour, a woman named Joan, who holds the strip of land adjoining the family's own, wrapped in a cloak nearly identical to the one Robin wears, carrying a small covered basket against her hip. Neighbours in a village like this one did not so much visit as drift in and out of each other's lives constantly, and Joan lets herself in without much ceremony, stamping snow from her boots on the threshold. "Brought you some of the wax," Joan says, setting the basket down, and inside it, wrapped in cloth, sit several lumps of beeswax, honey gold and faintly sweet-smelling even through the wrapping. This is a small transaction, but not a simple one. Joan's family keeps the hives, the same hives that belong to young Hal's household, and in a good year they trade wax and a little honey for things the beekeeping family cannot easily produce themselves, in this case a portion of wool thread that Agnes has been quietly setting aside from her own work for exactly this purpose. Money changes hands rarely in a village economy like this one. Favours, goods and labour circulate instead, a whole intricate web of obligation and reciprocity that keeps a community solvent through a season when almost nothing new can be grown or gathered. Edith thanks her and fetches the promised thread, and the 2 women fall into easy conversation by the fire, the kind that requires no particular purpose, about whose chickens have stopped laying for the season, about a sickness that swept briefly through the pigs 3 farms over and, thank goodness, seems to have stopped there, about whether the frost will hold hard enough this week for the pond to be safe for the children to skate on with bound bones tied to their boots. Agnes listens with half her attention, spindle still turning, and notes that Joan does not mention Hal at all, and finds herself, against her own will, a little disappointed by that. Joan does not stay long. Nobody stays long on a morning like this one, not when there is work waiting in every direction, but even a short visit like this one matters more than it might seem to from the outside. Winter in a village was, in its own way, a season of intensified closeness, families thrown back on each other by the simple fact that there was less distance one could put between houses when the roads iced over and travel to the nearest market town became a genuine risk rather than a mild inconvenience. People leaned on their neighbours in winter the way they leaned on their own stored grain, as something that had been prepared for in advance and that mattered more once the leaner months arrived. After Joan leaves, Edith turns her attention to the pit, the storage pit dug into the driest corner of the byre floor, lined with straw and covered with a heavy wooden lid weighted down with a stone. This is where the family's most vulnerable stores live through the winter, protected from frost by the insulating mass of the earth itself, a trick as old as farming and just as reliable now as it was when her grandmother's grandmother used the same method. She lifts the lid, and the smell that rises is earthy and faintly sweet, the smell of stored root vegetables settling into their long winter sleep. There are turnips here, and a good store of parsnips, sweeter after the first hard frost has touched them in the ground, something every farming family learns and few modern people ever discover, that frost does not ruin certain vegetables, it improves them, converting some of their starch into sugar as a kind of natural defense against the cold. There is a sack of onions, hung rather than buried, strings of them dangling from the rafters overhead where Edith glanced earlier, and a good quantity of dried peas and beans in sealed clay jars, protected from the mice that would otherwise consider this pit a banquet laid out in their honour. Meat is a different matter, and a more anxious one. The family slaughtered a pig back in November, at Martinmas, the traditional time for it, when the animal had fattened through autumn on windfall apples and acorns, and could not in any case be fed through a winter with no surplus to spare for it. Almost nothing of that pig went to waste. The meat that was not eaten fresh in the days immediately after slaughter was salted heavily and packed into barrels, or hung to smoke slowly over the hearth fire until it dried into something that would keep for months. Even now, if Edith looks up, she can see 2 smoked joints hanging from a beam near the smoke hole, dark and leathery looking, utterly unappetizing to modern eyes, and to this family one of the most valuable objects in the entire house. The blood, the fat rendered down into lard, Even parts most modern cooks would consider unusable, all of it found its way into some form of preservation or another, because a family in this world did not have the luxury of squeamishness. Waste was not wasteful in some abstract moral sense. Waste was danger. Waste was the difference between a full larder in February and a hungry one. Edith checks the salt pork barrel, presses her palm briefly against the brine to feel that it is still properly cold and has not begun to sour, and closes the lid again, satisfied. This kind of checking, this quiet daily accounting of what remains and what must still last, is a task that falls almost entirely to her, and one she takes a peculiar, private pride in. A household's survival through winter was measured less in any single dramatic effort and more in 1,000 small acts of foresight like this one, repeated daily, mostly invisible, entirely essential. Out beyond the byre, Walter has reached the edge of the family's strips in the open field system that surrounds the village, land that in summer would be a shifting sea of green and gold, wheat and barley, and the fallow strip resting between them, and that now lies under a crust of frost so hard it crunches audibly under his boots with every step, a sound like walking on stale bread. The furrows from autumn ploughing are still visible beneath a thin dusting of snow, ridged lines running the length of the strip, waiting out the winter the way the whole world seems to be waiting, patient and still, and holding something in reserve. He is not here to work the soil today. Nothing works in soil frozen this hard, and any farmer who tried would only ruin his tools against it. Instead, his task is the fencing, the low-woven hurdles that mark the boundary of the family's strips and keep any stray livestock, theirs or a neighbour's, from wandering onto stubble that still holds some grazing value even now. One section near the northern corner has come loose, a few of the woven branches worked free by wind and the weight of drifted snow, and he kneels to repair it with the quiet, unhurried competence of a man who has mended this same fence, or ones exactly like it, more times than he could count. His breath comes out in visible clouds as he works, and the cold has a particular quality out here in the open field that it does not have inside the cottage, a cold with wind behind it, a cold that finds the gap between glove and sleeve and settles there like an uninvited guest. Walter does not mind it as much as you might expect. There is something almost clarifying about hard outdoor work in real, biting cold, a simplicity to it, the whole of his attention narrowed down to the exact width of a branch and the exact angle it needs to be woven in at, and for a few minutes at a time, the wider worries of the season, whether the grain will stretch far enough, whether the roof will hold through the next real storm, recede into the back of his mind and leave him with nothing but the immediate, satisfying problem of one broken fence. Above him, a pale winter sun sits low and small in a sky the colour of skimmed milk, giving light without much warmth, the kind of sun that seems present mostly as a formality. It will set again before 4 in the afternoon. This is a fact of the season that shapes nearly everything about how this family lives. The brutal shortness of the days, barely 8 hours of usable light at this latitude in the depth of winter, which means every task that can be done must be done efficiently, must be fitted into a window that closes faster than anyone would like. Walter finishes the fence, tests it with a firm shove that it holds against without complaint, and straightens, pressing a hand briefly against the small of his back, where 20 years of exactly this kind of labour have left a permanent, familiar ache. He allows himself a moment simply to stand still and look out over the frozen field, at the dark line of the woods beyond it, at a single crow crossing the pale sky in no apparent hurry, and there is something in the stillness of it that he could not name if you asked him, something close to contentment, though he would never think to call it that himself. It is simply the shape of a winter morning, and he has known enough of them now to trust it. Back inside, with the wax stored away and the wool basket refilled, Edith finds herself with a rare stretch of quiet. Robin still out at the hedge line, Agnes absorbed in her spinning, and she uses it to do something she does not often let herself do in the middle of a working morning. She sits, just for a few minutes, on the low stool nearest the fire, and reaches into the pocket sewn into the inside of her kirtle for a small bundle of dried herbs tied with a scrap of thread. This is the part of Edith's life that she keeps mostly to herself, not from shame exactly, though there is a thread of something like caution woven through it, but from a sense that it belongs to her alone, a private inheritance passed down a very specific line. Her mother was known throughout their old village, 3 parishes over, as a woman with a gift for herbs and healing, called on for fevers, for difficult births, for the small daily complaints that had no other remedy available. She taught Edith everything she knew before she died, patiently, over years, which plants eased pain and which were dangerous, which teas calmed a fretful infant and which poultices drew the heat out of a wound. And Edith has carried that knowledge with her into this marriage, into this village, the way another woman might carry a piece of her mother's jewellery. She does not advertise it. There is a carefulness required in this kind of knowledge that goes beyond simple modesty. A woman with too visible a reputation for this sort of skill sometimes draws suspicion along with gratitude, whispers about where such knowledge truly comes from, and Edith has seen once, years ago in her own mother's village, what that suspicion can curdle into if it is allowed to grow unchecked. So she keeps it quiet. She is called on now and then, discreetly, by neighbours who trust her, for a headache remedy, for something to help a colicky baby sleep, and she gives what help she can, and asks for nothing beyond what is freely offered in return, and she does not speak of it in the wider village beyond the small circle of women who already know. There is a particular tenderness in this bundle of herbs she holds now, dried feverfew and something else, chamomile perhaps. She was taught the names in a dialect that does not translate perfectly even to her own daughter, and she brings it briefly to her face and breathes in, and for a moment she is not 34, and in her own cottage at all. She is 9 years old, sitting at her mother's knee in a different cottage entirely, watching those same quick, sure hands sort leaves by feel in the dark, being told, in a voice she can still hear clearly though its owner has been gone 12 years now, that this was not witchcraft, whatever anyone said. This was only paying close attention to the world God had made, and using what it offered. She has not decided yet whether to teach Agnes properly the way she herself was taught. Agnes has shown an aptitude for it already, an unbidden curiosity whenever Edith works with the herbs, but there is real risk in that inheritance along with the real value, and Edith has spent more nights than she would admit turning the question over in her mind without arriving anywhere near a decision. For now, it stays hers alone, this quiet second knowledge running underneath the ordinary rhythms of the household, something she carries the way she carries the weight of the winter stores, privately, carefully, without needing anyone else to see the full shape of it. Quietly, she ties the bundle closed again and tucks it back into her pocket, just as Robin's voice sounds from outside, calling something about the kindling basket being full at last, and the moment closes as quietly as it opened, leaving nothing behind but a faint herbal smell on her fingers and a warmth in her chest that has nothing to do with the fire. Robin comes in stamping his feet, kindling basket finally full and overflowing slightly, with what Edith suspects are at least a few sticks too green to burn well, though she says nothing about it, and he shrugs out of the oversized cloak and hangs it on its peg with more care than his usual scattering of belongings would suggest, a small sign that even an 8-year-old understands, on some level, that clothing in winter is not a thing to be careless with. This is worth pausing on for a moment, the clothing itself, because it tells you more about how this family survives the cold than almost anything else in the house. Nobody here owns a single heavy coat the way we might picture it. Instead, warmth comes from layers, several of them, each one thin enough to move in, stacked together until the combination does what one thick garment never could. Underneath everything, next to the skin, is linen, a shift for Edith and Agnes, a long shirt for Walter and Robin, chosen specifically because linen wicks moisture away from the body far better than wool does, keeping a person from the particular misery of being damp with their own sweat inside heavy clothing. Over that comes wool, sometimes 2 layers of it, a kirtle or tunic, and then for outdoor work, a heavier over tunic. Wool, unlike linen, keeps its warming properties even when slightly damp, which matters enormously in a climate where staying perfectly dry through a full working day outside is simply not realistic. Then the outer layer, the cloaks, heavy and roughly woven, sometimes lined with an inner layer of unspun fleece for extra warmth. fastened at the throat with a simple pin or brooch, in this family's case a plain bronze one, that has passed down through 3 generations and fastens Walter's cloak this morning exactly as it fastened his grandfather's decades before he was born. Hoods, mittens knitted from the coarser leftover wool that was not fine enough for clothing. And on the feet, thick woolen hose under leather shoes that Walter resoles himself every autumn with hide he has cured and prepared through the summer months for exactly this purpose. None of it is waterproof in any way we would recognize. None of it would satisfy a modern hiker heading into truly severe weather. But layered correctly, understood correctly, worn with the accumulated wisdom of generations who had no other option but to get this right, it works, and works well enough that a family like this one thinks nothing of spending whole days outside in temperatures that would send most modern people scrambling for the nearest heated building within minutes. Agnes glances over at Robin's damp mittens, drying now on a small rack near the fire, and says something quietly teasing about how he will need new ones knitted before the winter is out, at the rate he is wearing through the wool at the fingertips. And Robin, with the wounded dignity particular to younger brothers everywhere, insists it is not his fault the hedge has thorns in it. Edith listens to this small skirmish with half an ear, the familiar comfortable noise of her children being exactly themselves, and does not intervene. Some arguments are not really arguments at all. They are just another kind of conversation, worn into a groove so familiar it barely registers as conflict anymore. By midday the light outside has not changed much, still that same pale formal sun sitting low over the frozen fields, but the household's rhythm shifts anyway, the way it does every day at roughly this hour, toward the second meal, lighter than breakfast but no less welcome for it. There is more of the pottage, the pot never quite empty, and today Edith adds a handful of dried apple slices toward the end, softened by the heat, releasing a faint sweetness into the broth that makes Robin declare, with the total conviction of an 8-year-old, that this is now his favourite meal of all time, a title he awarded to something else entirely just 2 days ago, and will likely reassign again by tomorrow. Walter comes in from the fields partway through, cheeks wind-burned, hands nearly numb despite his mittens, and sits close to the fire while he eats, working feeling back into his fingers one careful flex at a time. He reports on the fence, on a set of fresh tracks he found near the tree line that he thinks belong to a fox rather than anything more concerning, on the state of the woodpile, which will need restocking from the larger reserve at the edge of the holding within the week. This kind of report happens every day, unremarkable in itself, but it is how a household like this one actually functions, a constant low-level exchange of information between the people responsible for different parts of its survival, small updates traded over meals the way a modern family might trade updates about traffic or the weather forecast, except that here the stakes sit just slightly closer to the bone. After the meal, with the short afternoon already beginning to lean toward its early end, Edith takes down the lump of beeswax Joan brought that morning and sets it near the fire to soften slightly before working it. This is not for candles today, though it sometimes is. Today the wax is destined for something smaller and more immediately useful, a waterproofing treatment for the seams of Walter's boots, worked in with careful fingers while it is warm and pliable, sealing the stitching against the wet that would otherwise seep in through every crack and leave his feet damp and miserable through a full day of outdoor labour. It is the kind of maintenance task that takes perhaps 20 minutes and saves weeks of discomfort, the sort of quiet foresight that runs through nearly everything this family does, though nobody in the room would think to describe it in such grand terms. To them it is simply Tuesday. Agnes watches her mother work the wax into the leather, fascinated despite having seen it done a dozen times before, and asks, the way she has taken to asking about a great many small household crafts lately, whether she might try it herself sometime. Edith says yes, of course, and means it, recognizing in the question the same hunger to understand and eventually take over these small essential skills that she herself felt at Agnes's age, watching her own mother's hands do work that seemed, at the time, indistinguishable from magic. There is water to fetch too, and this task falls to Agnes this afternoon, a walk down to the well at the edge of the village green with a wooden yoke across her shoulders and a bucket hanging from each end, empty on the way there and considerably heavier on the way back. The well itself has a thin skin of ice across the top of the visible water, broken already by whoever drew water there earlier in the morning, and Agnes cracks the newly formed layer with the heel of the bucket before lowering it down on its rope, the sound of the ice breaking sharp and clear in the cold, quiet air. She is not alone at the well. 2 other girls from the village have arrived on the same errand. One of them a girl named Cecily she has known since before either of them could properly walk, and for a few minutes the task of drawing water becomes almost secondary to the far more pressing business of talking. 3 girls' voices overlapping and rising in the cold air, breath visible with every word, laughter carrying further than it would in warmer weather, when there is more ambient noise to swallow it. This is one of the genuine unglamorous pleasures of a life like this one, the way that even a chore as plain as fetching water becomes, almost automatically, an occasion for company, because company is not scheduled or arranged in a village like this one so much as it simply accumulates, wherever 2 or 3 people happen to be doing the same necessary thing at the same necessary hour. Cecily mentions, with poorly concealed excitement, that her family is planning to host some of the neighbours on the coming feast day, the 12th night after Christmas, when the strict fasting and labour of the deep winter season traditionally eases for one bright, loud evening of shared food and games, and a particular kind of good-natured chaos that the whole village looks forward to for weeks in advance. Agnes feels a small flare of anticipation at the mention of it, and something else too, a flicker of hope that Hal's family might be among those attending, which she does not say aloud, though Cecily, watching her friend's face with the sharp attentiveness of a 12-year-old who misses very little, seems to guess at it anyway, and says nothing, only smiles slightly into her own bucket. The walk back to the cottage, yokes loaded now and considerably harder going, takes Agnes past the low stone wall of the churchyard, past the bare black shapes of the elm trees that line the village green, past smoke rising in thin grey threads from every chimney hole in sight, a whole small world of households doing, at this exact hour, more or less exactly what her own family is doing, tending fires, rationing stores, waiting out the same long cold together, separately, each behind their own walls, and somehow still, in the way that matters most, not really alone at all. By the time Agnes reaches the cottage again, arms aching pleasantly from the weight of the yokes, the light outside has already begun its slow retreat, the pale sun sinking toward the tree line, though it is not yet the middle of the afternoon by any clock, if this household owned one, which it does not. Time here is measured differently, not by hours marked on a face, but by the position of light, by the rhythm of tasks, by the sound of the church bell 3 fields away marking certain fixed points of the day for prayer, and right now that light is telling everyone under this roof the same clear, wordless thing. The short day is closing. Whatever needs doing outside needs doing soon. Walter comes in for the last time before dark, having spent the remaining daylight splitting logs at the woodpile, the rhythmic sound of his axe carrying faintly across the frozen yard, for the better part of an hour, a sound so constant through the winter months that Edith has stopped consciously hearing it at all, the way a person stops hearing their own heartbeat. He stacks the newly split wood just inside the byre door, dry and ready, and shakes the last of the wood chips from his cloak before ducking back inside for good. Robin is called in from wherever the last of his outdoor energy has taken him, protesting mildly, as he does every single evening, that it cannot possibly be time to come in yet, and is overruled, as he is every single evening, by the simple undeniable fact of the fading light. The shutter over the small window is drawn fully closed now, the last thread of grey daylight sealed out, and the cottage settles into the particular self-contained world it becomes every night at this hour, lit only by the fire and, tonight, by a single tallow candle that Edith allows herself to light because there is mending to finish before the light, for it disappears entirely. Supper is a simpler affair than either of the day's earlier meals, more of the same pottage, a heel of the week's bread, a small portion of the cheese made from their goat's milk back in the autumn, sharp and crumbling slightly at the edges. Nobody minds the repetition. In a household like this one, sameness is not boredom, it is security, the reassurance of a rhythm that has been tested and trusted across many winters before this one, and will, everyone quietly believes, carry them through this one too. After supper, the bowls set aside to be properly washed in the morning, when there is better light to see the work by. The family gathers close around the fire in the way they do most nights, Walter mending a length of leather harness by candlelight, his big hands surprisingly delicate with the awl and thread, Edith returning to her own mending, a torn seam in one of Robin's shirts that has clearly been torn and repaired more than once already. Agnes sits nearest the fire with what remains of her wool for the day, and Robin, evening energy finally beginning to ebb, settles on the floor near his father's feet with the particular boneless collapse of a small boy who has been outside for most of a cold day and has only just now realized how tired that makes a person. This is when the stories come, most nights unhurried and half improvised, the fire throwing soft moving light across the low ceiling, while Walter or Edith, whoever feels like talking that evening, offers up some tale worn smooth from telling, half history and half embellishment by now, the line between the two blurred past caring. Tonight it is Edith's turn, and she tells, not for the first time, the story of her own grandmother's winter, decades ago now, when a storm kept the whole village snowed in for the better part of 2 weeks, and the church bell had to be rung by hand every few hours, just so travellers caught out in the whiteness would have some sound to walk toward. Robin, half asleep already, asks the same question he always asks at this point in the story, whether anyone got lost, and Edith gives the same answer she always gives, that one young man did wander a little off course but was found safe by morning, thanks to that very bell, a detail that satisfies Robin every single time, as though he has never heard it before. There is something in this repetition, Edith thinks, that matters more than novelty would. A story told the same way, night after night, becomes less like information and more like a lullaby, its comfort located not in surprise, but in the opposite of surprise, in the reliable, unchanging shape of it. Agnes, older now, has started noticing the small variations her mother allows herself from telling to telling, a slightly different description of the snow, a slightly longer pause before the ending, and she has begun, this winter, to understand something about storytelling that she did not understand a year ago, that a story is not a fixed thing being recited, but a living thing being made fresh each time in the telling, shaped a little differently by the mood of the room, and the hour of the night, and the faces gathered close around the fire to hear it. Robin's question about the storm and Edith's story of it lead naturally enough to Walter mentioning, from his corner near the harness leather, that Christmas is not so many weeks off now, a comment that makes even sleepy Robin's eyes open a little wider. Christmas in a household like this one is not the single day of gift-giving and decoration that the word tends to summon for us now. It is the centre point of a much longer season, stretching across 12 full days from the feast itself through to Epiphany in early January, a stretch of time that carries real weight in the rhythm of the agricultural year, because it falls at almost the only point in the whole calendar when outdoor labour is actually, officially reduced, when the church calendar itself grants a kind of sanctioned rest that the rest of the year rarely allows. There will be a good meal on the day itself, better than any ordinary supper, likely involving whatever fowl the family can spare from the flock, and there will be visits between households, the kind of visiting that happens all through winter but grows more frequent and more festive across these 12 days specifically. There will be games too, simple ones, played by firelight, guessing games and riddles, and a particular one involving a ring hidden inside a portion of Christmas bread that Robin has been talking about since roughly October, already anxious about whether he will be the lucky one to find it this year, as he was not last year, a disappointment he has clearly not fully recovered from. 12th night itself, the evening Cecily mentioned so eagerly at the well, closes the whole stretch with its own particular energy, a night when the ordinary rules of the household sometimes loosen a little, when a servant might, in wealthier houses, briefly play master for an evening as part of the fun, and when in a village like this one the same spirit shows up in smaller ways, in louder laughter than usual, in games that run later into the night than any other evening of the year, in a kind of collectively agreed permission to be, for just one night, a little less careful than the rest of the winter demands. After that comes a quieter stretch, weeks of the deepest cold with no feast day to break it up, until Candlemas arrives in early February, the day that traditionally marks the halfway point of winter, and, more practically for this family, the day by which half of the season's stored food and half of the season's firewood are meant to remain. A rough but honestly useful piece of household math passed down through generations, a way of checking, partway through the dark months, whether the family's preparations are holding up as planned, or whether adjustments need to be made before the second half of winter arrives to test them. Edith glances, almost without meaning to, toward the corner where the storage pit lies beneath the byre floor, doing the calculation in her head that she will not need to do formally for weeks yet, a habit of watchfulness so deeply worn into her that it happens now almost beneath conscious thought. The next morning brings a different kind of work for Walter, one that keeps him inside the barn attached to the byre rather than out in the open field, and it is work that Robin, once his own morning chores are done, likes to watch more than almost any other, though he has been told firmly more than once to keep well back while it happens. This is threshing, the separation of grain from the dried stalks harvested back in the autumn and stored since then in sheaves in the barn's loft, and the tool for it is a flail, 2 lengths of wood joined by a leather hinge, swung with a rhythm that looks deceptively simple and takes years to master without either exhausting yourself or, worse, catching your own shoulder with the swinging free end through a poorly timed stroke. Walter has done this work every winter of his adult life, and his body has found its own economical rhythm for it, a rhythm Robin watches with something close to reverence, the swing and crack of it filling the barn with a steady percussive sound that carries, muffled, even into the main room of the house. This work cannot be rushed and cannot easily be done in autumn or spring, when other labour crowds the calendar too thickly to spare the hours. Winter, for all its hardship, offers something no other season does, and that is time, stretches of it, carved out by the simple fact that the fields themselves are closed for business, and a family that manages that time well finds itself considerably better prepared come spring than one that lets the short dark days slide by unused. The threshed grain still needs winnowing after this, tossed carefully in a shallow basket so the wind, or in this case the draught from the open barn door, carries away the lighter chaff and leaves the heavier grain behind, and this part of the task falls sometimes to Agnes, when her other work allows, a job she finds satisfying in a way she has never quite been able to explain, something about watching the useless parts simply lift away and vanish, leaving only what actually matters behind. Tools need attention too, through these same winter weeks, and on a bright cold afternoon later that same week, Walter sits near the byre door with a whetstone, running it along the edge of a scythe blade that will not be needed again until the hay is ready to cut in early summer, but that needs sharpening now, while there is time to do it properly, rather than in the rushed panic of the coming harvest season, when there will be no spare hour to spend on maintenance. The plough too gets its winter inspection, wooden parts checked for cracks, the iron share examined for wear, small repairs made now that would cost far more in lost time if they were discovered instead, in the middle of spring ploughing, when every single day matters and none can be spared for fixing what should have been fixed months before. Ale brewing happens on a different afternoon entirely, a task that belongs mostly to Edith, as it does in most households of this kind, and one that fills the cottage for a full day with a warm, faintly sweet, faintly bitter smell that Robin has always associated, without quite realizing it, with a particular kind of contentment. This is not the hopped beer that would come to dominate English brewing centuries later. This ale is made simply from malted barley steeped and boiled and left to ferment with wild yeast that lives, unseen, in the very air of the cottage and in the grain of the wooden vessels used for the purpose, vessels that are never fully scrubbed clean, precisely because that resident yeast is valuable and worth preserving from one brewing to the next. This kind of ale is not primarily a drink for pleasure, though nobody in the household would turn down a cup of it for exactly that reason on a cold evening. It serves a more practical purpose too, one worth remembering. Water in a medieval village, particularly one drawn from a shared well or a stream that also serves livestock somewhere upstream, cannot always be trusted for its cleanliness, while the brewing process, the boiling in particular, renders the ale considerably safer to drink than the water it was made from. Even the children in this household drink a weak version of it regularly, a small ale brewed for shorter fermentation and lower strength, alongside milk from the goat, and nobody thinks anything of it. It is simply how a family stays adequately hydrated through a season when the alternative carries genuine, if usually invisible, risk. Laundry, by contrast, is one of the few tasks that winter makes truly harder rather than merely different, and Edith approaches washing day this week with the particular resignation of someone facing an unavoidable unpleasantness. Clothes are washed in cold water drawn from the well, worked by hand against a washing board, or simply pounded and wrung by main force. No fire involved in the process itself beyond what might be spared afterward to help dry the heaviest pieces near the hearth, since hanging wet wool outside in freezing temperatures would only leave it frozen stiff rather than dry. It is hard, cold work, unglamorous besides, and Edith does it as infrequently as she reasonably can through the coldest months, favouring instead careful daily brushing and airing of clothes to keep them presentable between the less frequent full washes, a practical compromise that keeps chapped, aching hands from suffering more than the season already demands of them. On a bright afternoon a few days later, with a fresh dusting of snow lying clean and undisturbed across the village green, Robin gets his wish at last. Permission to go with several other children down to the shallow end of the mill pond, now frozen solid enough, his father has judged after careful inspection, to bear a child's weight safely. They do not have skates in any form we would recognize, but some of the older children have bound smooth, flattened animal bones to the soles of their shoes with leather straps, and slide across the ice on these in a manner that looks equal parts skilled and utterly reckless, shrieking with laughter every time someone loses their balance and goes down in a tangle of limbs and flying snow. Robin has no bones of his own yet, considered still a little young for it, and contents himself instead with sliding on his boot soles alone, arms windmilling for balance, cheeks bright red with cold and effort and pure unfiltered joy. Edith watches this small chaos of sliding, shrieking children from the edge of the pond, arms crossed against the cold, standing beside two other mothers who have wandered down for the same reason, half supervision and half simple pleasure in watching their children be, for a little while, entirely and uncomplicatedly happy. One of the women, an older widow named Marjorie who has raised 5 children of her own through winters considerably harder than this one has been so far, remarks that the ice always brings out something in children that nothing else quite manages, a kind of joy that seems almost too large for their small bodies to hold, and Edith finds herself nodding in complete agreement, watching Robin go down hard on his backside for the 3rd time in 10 minutes and pop back up laughing before the words of concern have even fully formed in her mouth. Baking, too, becomes a small communal event this week, though not in the way it happens in wealthier manor households with their own private kitchens. This village, like most of its kind, has a single large communal oven, built of stone and maintained collectively, and households take turns through the week bringing their prepared dough to be baked in its considerable retained heat, several families' bread going in at once to make the most efficient use of the fuel required to heat the great oven properly. It is Edith's turn today, and she carries her shaped loaves the short distance to the oven wrapped in cloth against the cold, finding 2 other women already there ahead of her, tending the fire that has been building inside the oven's stone chamber since before dawn. There is a particular kind of talk that happens around a communal oven that does not happen anywhere else in the village, unhurried and wide-ranging, women waiting together for their bread to bake with nothing much else demanding their immediate attention. And today the talk turns, as it often does this time of year, to who among the village's young people might be walking out together once the weather allows for proper courting again in the spring. Edith notices, with the private amusement of a mother who has begun putting small pieces together, that Hal's name comes up more than once, and that when it does, one of the other women glances briefly her way with the particular knowing look of someone who has noticed exactly the same thing Edith herself has been quietly noticing about her daughter these past weeks. Neither of them says anything directly. Village women rarely need to. The bread comes out an hour later, crusts dark and fragrant, and Edith carries the warm loaves home wrapped again against the cold, the smell of them filling the cottage the moment she steps through the low door, drawing Robin over instantly with the single-minded focus he reserves for anything involving food, fresh enough to still be steaming. Sunday brings the whole family to the village church, a squat stone building at the heart of the village that has stood, according to the oldest residents, for longer than anyone can precisely say, its walls thick enough to hold a certain persistent chill even when it is not being actively heated by anything at all, since no fire burns inside it. The family walks the short distance together, breath visible, boots crunching over the frozen path, and inside they stand for the service among neighbours they have known their whole lives. The cold inside the stone building, almost sharper than the cold outside had been, a fact everyone accepts without much comment, because it has simply always been this way. Walter stands near the back with the other men of similar standing in the village, Edith and the children a little further forward, and Robin fidgets through most of the service with the barely contained restlessness of a boy his age, earning one quiet warning look from his mother that is enough, for now, to still him. The priest's voice carries through the cold stone space, and though Robin understands perhaps a third of the Latin actually spoken, he has absorbed, the way children do, the shape and rhythm of the whole ritual, standing and kneeling at the correct moments almost by instinct. Afterward, the churchyard becomes, briefly, the most crowded and lively place in the entire village, the whole community gathered together in one place for once, exchanging news and small pleasantries in the cold morning air before everyone disperses back to their separate holdings. This weekly gathering matters more in winter than in any other season, Edith has always thought, precisely because the rest of the week offers so little natural occasion for the whole village to come together this way, each household otherwise sealed into its own small warm world for days at a stretch. Night itself, when it finally comes at the end of these full varied days, brings its own particular set of small rituals that this family has refined over years of practice. Before bed, a stone that has sat near the edge of the hearth all evening, absorbing heat, gets wrapped carefully in a scrap of old wool and tucked down near the foot of the shared bed, a simple ancient version of the hot water bottle that does real meaningful work against the deep chill that settles into a room once the fire itself has been banked down for the night. Robin, whose feet run perpetually cold no matter the season, has claimed something close to a permanent right to sleep nearest whichever warming stone is in use on any given night, a small household negotiation that nobody bothers to formally contest anymore. The bed itself, shared as it is by the whole family in various configurations depending on the severity of the cold, sits close enough to the dying fire to benefit from its last retained warmth, and heavy woolen blankets, along with the family's few precious furs, are layered thick enough that once everyone has settled and the initial shock of cold sheets has passed, a kind of deep, total warmth builds up beneath the covers that Edith privately considers one of the genuine, unheralded comforts of this entire way of life, a warmth earned rather than simply switched on, and somehow sweeter for the earning. Weeks slide by the way winter weeks do in a household with this much steady work to fill them, each day distinct in its small particulars and yet part of the same larger familiar rhythm, until one morning Edith wakes to find that Christmas itself, the day she has been quietly tracking toward for weeks, has finally arrived. She knows it not from any calendar on the wall, since the family owns no such thing, but from the accumulated weight of preparation behind her, the extra portion of grain set aside weeks ago specifically for today's baking, the goose that Walter has been fattening separately from the rest of the small flock since autumn, the general hum of anticipation that has been building steadily through the household for days now, impossible to miss even in a family that does not make a great show of its feelings. Morning begins, as it always does, with the fire coaxed back to life from its overnight embers, but there is a different quality to the air today, something Edith cannot fully name beyond the simple fact that everyone wakes a little faster, a little more willingly than on an ordinary working morning. Robin is up before anyone properly rouses him, an event so rare that Walter comments on it dryly before he has even fully opened his own eyes, and Agnes, usually the last to stir, is close behind her brother, both children radiating the particular electric energy of youngsters who know that something good is truly coming and cannot quite hold still in anticipation of it. Walter goes out early to deal with the goose himself, a task he handles without ceremony but with evident care, and by mid-morning the bird is prepared and set to roast slowly over the hearth fire, a smell beginning to fill the cottage that is entirely unlike the familiar daily scent of simmering pottage, richer, fattier, the kind of smell that makes even a well-fed household's mouths water in anticipation. Edith, meanwhile, works at the special bread she bakes only on this one day of the year, worked through with dried fruit that has been carefully hoarded since autumn specifically for this purpose, raisins and a few precious dried plums traded for at the last market before the roads grew too treacherous for regular travel, and somewhere inside that loaf, wrapped carefully in a scrap of clean cloth before it goes into the dough, sits a small ring, plain and worn, that has served this exact purpose in this family for longer than Edith herself has been alive. Robin cannot stop circling the bread as it bakes, radiating an anxiety about the ring that is only half performance, and Agnes, feeling suddenly generous in the way that older siblings sometimes do on days that call for it, tells him quietly that she hopes he finds it this year, and means it, though she herself has not forgotten her own disappointment from Christmases past. The family does not spend the whole of the day alone. In the early afternoon, once the church service marking the day itself has concluded and the whole village has spilled back out into the cold, bright air in a mood considerably more festive than any ordinary Sunday manages, several neighbouring families drift by the cottage in the loose, informal way that visiting happens during these 12 days specifically, Joan and her husband among them, bringing a small jar of preserved honey as a gift and staying only briefly before continuing on to another household further down the lane, part of a whole afternoon's worth of overlapping visits crisscrossing the village in every direction. By evening, with the goose eaten down to bones that will themselves go into tomorrow's pottage rather than be wasted, and the special bread reduced to crumbs, and the ring this year discovered with a shriek of pure triumph by Robin himself, who will speak of nothing else for at least the next several days, the family settles by the fire in a state of contented, well-fed exhaustion that feels different from their usual evening tiredness, softer somehow, less about hard labour finally finished, and more about a whole day spent, deliberately and without guilt, on nothing but warmth and company and small shared pleasures. Walter tells a story tonight instead of Edith, one from his own childhood, about a Christmas when he was perhaps Robin's age, and a sudden thaw turned the whole village green into a sea of mud 2 days before the feast, forcing an entire flock of geese, his own families included, to be driven through streets so treacherous that half the village turned out just to watch the spectacle and laugh at the indignity of it all. Robin, drowsy against his father's side, laughs at the image anyway, has heard this story before and will hear it again, and Agnes, watching her father's face soften with the telling of it, thinks, not for the first time, that there is something almost sacred about a story a person chooses to keep telling year after year, a way of keeping a particular version of themselves alive that might otherwise be lost to time, along with everything else that does not get spoken aloud and remembered on purpose. The days between Christmas and the New Year pass in that same loosened, festive rhythm, work still happening, because work never entirely stops in a household like this one, but happening at a gentler pace, with more room left over for visiting and games, and the particular pleasure of simply having other people's company more often than usual. Twelfth Night, when it finally arrives, lives up to everything Cecily promised at the well weeks before. The family gathers at Cecily's own household this year, along with a dozen or more others crowded into a cottage not much larger than their own. The noise and warmth of so many bodies together making the whole small building feel, for one night, considerably bigger than its actual walls would suggest. There are games that run late, guessing games, and a particular one involving passing a lit taper from hand to hand around the circle while a verse is recited, whoever holds it when the words run out facing some small good-natured forfeit, usually nothing worse than singing a verse of a song or answering an embarrassing question honestly. Robin is delighted by all of it in the uncomplicated way small children are delighted by noise and attention and staying up later than usual, and Agnes spends a good portion of the evening positioned, with what she hopes looks like complete indifference, somewhere within easy conversational distance of Hal, who has indeed come with his own family after all, and who says perhaps a dozen words to her across the whole evening, every one of which she will turn over privately in her mind for days afterward. Edith watches her daughter's careful, transparent efforts at nonchalance with quiet amusement and says nothing, choosing instead to let this particular unfolding happen at its own pace, the way her own mother let her own similarly clumsy adolescent attempts at courtship unfold decades before, without unnecessary interference. There is a version of parenting, she has come to believe, that consists mostly of knowing when not to speak. After 12th night, the season shifts again, the festive loosening of the 12 days giving way to the longer, quieter stretch that makes up the true heart of winter, weeks with no feast day to look forward to, just the steady accumulated work of keeping a household fed and warm through the coldest part of the year. This is, in some ways, the real test of everything the family prepared for back in autumn, this long unbroken middle stretch with nothing but its own patient repetition to sustain it, and Edith finds herself settling into it, not with dread, but with something closer to a practiced, comfortable resolve, the same feeling, she imagines, that a sailor might have setting out on a long, familiar crossing, aware of exactly how far there is still to go, and confident, from long experience, that the distance is entirely survivable. A storm arrives in the second week of January, the kind that Edith recognized the sound of building for the better part of a full day before it broke, wind shifting direction and gathering strength through the afternoon until, by nightfall, it has become something the whole family can hear pressing against the walls of the cottage, testing the thatch, rattling the shuttered window in its frame, with a persistence that would be alarming if this family had not weathered a dozen storms just like it in winters past. They do not fear it. This is worth saying plainly, because it would be easy to imagine a scene like this one as frightening, 4 people huddled against a howling threat outside their walls, and that is simply not the truth of how this family experiences it. The storm outside only sharpens, by contrast, how thoroughly prepared the inside of their small world already is. The fire burns steady and warm. The stores in the pit beneath the byre floor sit secure and dry. The animals, sharing their wall of warmth, are settled and calm. Robin, if anything, finds the storm faintly thrilling, pressing his ear at one point against the cold daub of the wall just to feel the wind's force vibrating through it, and Agnes works her spindle by firelight with no more urgency than any other evening, occasionally glancing up at the shuttered window with mild curiosity rather than any real concern. Walter checks the byre once more before full dark settles in, making sure the animals are secure and the door latched firmly against the wind, and comes back in satisfied, shaking loose snow from his shoulders, remarking only that it looks to be settling in for a proper blow tonight, the same dry, unbothered observation he might make about any weather at all. This is, in its own quiet way, one of the truest measures of how well this family has prepared for the season. A storm that might have felt like a genuine crisis to a less ready household passes through this one as little more than an especially loud, especially cozy evening, the wind's fury outside only making the warmth and stillness inside feel more complete by comparison. By morning, the storm has passed, leaving the whole village transformed under a fresh, heavy blanket of snow, deep enough in places to reach past Robin's knees, and deep enough, more practically, to require some real effort clearing a path from the cottage door to the byre before the animals can be properly tended. Walter and a neighbour from the adjoining holding work together at this task, as they do every year after a heavy snow, an unspoken arrangement of mutual aid that requires no discussion because it has simply always worked this way, each man clearing his own section and lending a hand at the shared boundary between their properties, the whole job finished in perhaps half the time it would have taken either of them working entirely alone. Later that same morning, word travels down the lane, the way news always travels in a village this size, that old Simon, a widower living alone at the far edge of the settlement, lost a section of his roof to the weight of the drifted snow overnight, and by early afternoon a small group of men from the surrounding holdings, Walter among them, have gathered at Simon's cottage with fresh bundles of reed and thatching tools to make the repair before another storm can catch the old man's home exposed. This is not treated by anyone involved as an act of particular generosity. It is simply understood, the way breathing is understood, that a hole in one household's roof during the depth of winter is everyone's concern, because the next storm makes no distinction between neighbours and strangers, and a community that lets one of its own go unsheltered has failed at something more fundamental than manners. A few days after the storm, a knock comes at the door in the middle of the afternoon, and this time it is not Joan with a friendly gift, but a young man from a holding on the far side of the village, breathless from hurrying, asking with poorly concealed worry whether Edith might come, his young wife having gone into a difficult labour earlier than anyone expected, weeks before the birth was thought to be due. Edith does not hesitate. She reaches immediately for a particular small basket kept always ready near the herb chest, stocked with exactly the things such a moment might call for, and tells Agnes, already pulling on her cloak, that she is in charge of supper and of her brother both, a responsibility Agnes accepts with a seriousness that makes her for a moment look considerably older than 12. This is the part of Edith's quiet private knowledge that occasionally steps out from the shadows and becomes, suddenly and urgently, the most important thing in the room. She walks quickly through the cold, the young man matching her pace beside her, and arrives to find the small cottage tense with the particular charged atmosphere of a household in the middle of something frightening, and Edith does what she has done perhaps a dozen times before in her years in this village, moves through the fear with calm, practiced hands, checking, reassuring, offering the specific herbs she has brought to ease pain and to help things along when they have stalled, staying steady in her voice, even when the room around her is not steady at all. She does not return home until well after dark, tired in a way that goes beyond physical, but with good news to carry back through the cold with her, a healthy child, smaller than hoped but breathing well and strong-voiced, and a mother resting now, exhausted but safely past the worst of it. Walter, waiting up despite the late hour, asks no questions beyond whether all is well, and accepts her tired nod as answer enough, understanding without needing it explained that some of what his wife carries in that basket and in her own steady hands is not really his to ask about in detail, only to be grateful for. Agnes, still awake though she should not be, watches her mother settle by the banked fire and thinks, not for the first time but perhaps more clearly than before, that she wants this too, someday, this particular kind of quiet, essential competence, the ability to walk into a frightened room and leave it calmer than she found it. She does not say this aloud tonight, but something in the way she watches her mother's tired, satisfied face tells Edith, without a single word passing between them, that the question of whether to teach her daughter properly has in some sense already begun answering itself. The wool that Agnes has spent so many quiet hours spinning through these winter weeks, hour upon patient hour, with the drop spindle turning between her fingers while her thoughts wandered freely elsewhere, does not simply accumulate uselessly, of course. Once enough thread has built up, wound onto spindles and stored in a growing pile near the loom, it moves to the next stage of its transformation, and this stage belongs to Edith working at the simple upright loom set up in the corner of the main room, a tool almost as old as the cottage itself, inherited along with the house from Walter's own mother. Weaving is slower, more demanding work than spinning, requiring a kind of sustained attention that does not leave much room for the wandering thoughts Agnes indulges while her own hands work the spindle, and Edith often works at it in the evenings after the children are settled, the rhythmic sound of the shuttle passing through the warp threads becoming for Walter one of the last sounds he hears most nights before sleep finally takes him. This cloth, emerging from slow, patient labour over the course of the winter, will become, come spring and summer, the family's next set of clothing, replacing garments worn thin by the previous year's wear, and there is something Edith finds deeply satisfying in tracing the whole chain of it backward in her mind, from a finished length of rough grey wool cloth all the way back to a specific afternoon months earlier when she or Agnes sheared it from a specific animal in their own small flock. Almost nothing this family wears or eats or burns for warmth arrives from anywhere outside the reach of their own hands and their own small patch of land, and there is a kind of quiet dignity in that total, comprehensive self-sufficiency that a modern person, surrounded by objects whose origins they could not begin to trace, might find it hard to fully imagine. Even the animals seem to sense this same patient rhythm running underneath the household's days, the goat settling into a feeding schedule with a kind of trusting regularity, the hens returning each evening to their same corner of warmth without needing to be herded or coaxed, every creature under this roof, human and otherwise, moving through the season according to a shape worn familiar by long unhurried repetition. There is something worth pausing on here too, about the particular kind of patience this whole way of life demands and teaches in equal measure. Nothing in this household happens quickly. Wool becomes cloth across a whole winter's worth of patient spinning and weaving. Grain becomes bread only after a whole growing season, followed by careful storage, followed by the daily labor of the oven. A skill like Agnes's herbal knowledge takes years to build properly, plant by plant, remedy by remedy, and even then continues deepening across a whole lifetime, rather than arriving complete at any single point. Edith has come to think of this slowness not as a limitation to be endured, but as something closer to the whole shape of a well-lived life, each small task given exactly the time it actually requires, no more and no less, and something in that unhurried rhythm she has always felt suits the particular temperament of this family better than any faster way of living ever could. Robin's education, such as it is, happens gradually and in scattered pieces, rather than through any formal schooling of the kind a wealthier family's son might receive, since a boy of his station is not destined for the kind of book learning reserved for the sons of wealthier families or those bound for the church. Walter teaches him what he needs to know the way he himself was taught, by bringing him along, by narrating the reasoning behind each small task as he performs it, explaining why the fence needs mending in this particular way and not another, why the flail must swing just so, why a certain kind of cloud in the western sky means weather worth watching for. Robin absorbs numbers this way too, not through any lesson but through counting sheep, counting logs in the woodpile, counting the days until some anticipated event, a practical arithmetic built entirely from things that actually matter to an 8-year-old's daily world. In the evenings, when the mending and spinning and weaving allow for it, the family sometimes turns to music instead of stories, Walter producing a simple wooden pipe he carved himself years ago and plays with more enthusiasm than genuine skill, while Edith sings, her voice low and unpolished but warm, old songs about the turning of the seasons and the patience required to wait out a hard winter, songs that Robin and Agnes have absorbed so thoroughly over the years that they hum along without quite realizing they know every word. These evenings do not happen every night. They do not need to, but when they do, they leave behind a particular warmth that lingers in the cottage for days afterward, the way the smell of good bread lingers long after the loaf itself has been eaten. There are curious small habits of hygiene and health in this household that would surprise most people who assume, wrongly, that medieval life meant simple filth and neglect. Nobody bathes fully as often as a modern person would consider normal, true enough, since heating enough water for a full bath is a genuine labor few households can spare the fuel for regularly through the cold months. But this does not mean the family goes uncared for. Edith keeps a small basin by the fire for daily washing of hands and face, and teeth are cleaned most mornings with a chewed hazel twig, frayed at one end into something like a crude brush, rubbed against the teeth with a mixture of salt and sometimes a little crushed herb for freshness, a habit passed down as automatically as any other morning routine. When illness does visit, as it inevitably does at some point through every winter, the household understands sickness through a framework entirely different from our own, one built around the old idea of 4 humours needing to stay in careful balance, blood and phlegm, and the 2 forms of bile, each associated with particular qualities of heat and moisture, that a good remedy was thought to correct by working in the opposite direction. Edith's herbal knowledge sits comfortably inside this framework, understood by everyone in the household as simply how the body worked, no stranger to them than our own explanations would seem strange to us. A fever, thought to reflect an excess of heat, called for cooling herbs and rest in a quiet, shaded corner. A chill deep in the chest called for warming remedies. Sometimes a poultice of mustard or heated cloth pressed against it. None of it maps precisely onto modern medicine, and some of it, Edith would be the first to admit if pressed, does not always work as promised. But a great deal of it, built from centuries of careful observation even without the underlying science to explain why, actually helps, and that practical effectiveness matters more to this family than any theory behind it. The hens, meanwhile, have slowed considerably in their laying through these darkest weeks, a fact of poultry biology that this family understands perfectly well, even without any word for the underlying cause, the shortened daylight simply not providing enough hours of light to keep the birds producing at their summer rate. What eggs there are get carefully preserved rather than eaten immediately whenever there is a small surplus, coated in a thin layer of lard, or sometimes packed in a mixture of salt and ash that seals the shell's pores and keeps the egg usable for weeks or even months beyond what it would otherwise last, a trick that will matter considerably more in late winter when other fresh food has grown scarcer still. Nothing in this household gets discarded while it retains any possible use, and nowhere is that more visible than in the growing rag rug taking shape near the hearth, worked on in scattered spare minutes by whichever family member happens to have a few free moments and nimble enough fingers, woven from strips of cloth too worn or too small to serve any other purpose. Old shirts and outgrown garments cut down and braided together into something that will, by spring, provide one more small layer of warmth and comfort between bare feet and cold floor. Robin has taken this winter to adding the occasional strip himself, proud out of all proportion to the small contribution, and Edith lets him believe his few clumsy braids matter every bit as much as her own, because in the way that counts most, they genuinely do. There is a particular night, deep in the coldest stretch of the season, that Edith will remember afterward as the coldest of that entire winter, though nothing dramatic happens during it at all, nothing beyond the ordinary unfolding of an ordinary evening in a house that has, by this point in the season, settled fully into its winter rhythm. She remembers it instead for the quality of the cold itself, a stillness to the air outside so complete that even the usual wind has gone silent, leaving behind a kind of clarity, a sharpness to every small sound inside the cottage that the wind's constant low murmur usually blurs and softens. She can hear, with unusual precision, the small tick and settle of the fire as it burns down, the particular rhythm of Robin's breathing behind the hurdle screen, slower and deeper now than his daytime energy would ever suggest, the faint creak of the roof timbers contracting slightly in the cold, a sound the house makes every winter and that no longer worries anyone in the household, understood now as simply the building's own quiet way of responding to the temperature. Walter's hand, when it finds hers under the blankets without either of them quite deciding to reach for the other, is warm despite everything, and she holds it for a while without speaking, listening to the particular silence of a genuinely still winter night. The smell of the cottage at this hour is its own layered thing. Wood smoke settled deep into every surface after years of the same fire burning in the same spot. The faint mineral smell of the packed earth floor beneath its covering of rushes, the animal warmth drifting faintly from the shared wall with the byre. And underneath all of it, so familiar by now she barely registers it as a scent at all anymore, the smell of her own family, of wool and skin and the particular soap she makes each autumn from rendered fat and wood ash, a smell that she associates, without ever having consciously decided to, with the entire concept of home itself. Outside, she knows without needing to look, the whole village sits under the same enormous quiet, every chimney sending up its own thin thread of smoke into a sky that will be, if the clear cold holds until morning, thick with more stars than a summer night ever shows, the deep cold somehow sharpening the sky itself into something almost too crisp and bright to look at directly. She has seen this exact sky perhaps 30 times now across the winters of her life, and it has never once failed to make her feel, briefly, both entirely small and entirely solidly held, the two feelings arriving together the way they always do on a night like this one. She does not know, lying there in the dark with her husband's hand warm in hers and her children breathing steadily nearby, that this particular quality of stillness is one of the things she will find herself missing most decades from now, when she is very old and this same cottage has passed to other hands and other winters. She only knows in this moment that it is enough, this small warm world holding steady against an enormous cold one, and that there is nowhere else in the whole of that vast glittering night, silent and enormous, that she would rather be. A trip to the village mill becomes, later that same week, an excuse for Walter to take Robin along with him for the first time this winter, a small milestone in itself for a boy who has spent most of the season's outdoor excursions confined to the family's own modest holding, a journey of perhaps 20 minutes on foot to where the mill stands at a bend in the small river that has not, this year, frozen solid enough to stop its wheel from turning, though Walter mentions, almost as an aside, that he has seen winters cold enough to freeze it entirely, forcing the whole village to grind grain by hand with heavy stone querns until a thaw finally freed the wheel again. Robin walks close beside his father, matching his stride as best he can, carrying nothing himself today beyond his own evident pride at being included in what feels, to an 8-year-old, like distinctly grown-up business. The mill itself is a wonder to Robin every single time he sees it, the great wooden wheel turning steadily in the current, water sheeting off its paddles in a way that never stops being fascinating no matter how many times he has watched it, and inside, the miller, a broad, flour-dusted man everyone in the village knows, simply as Miller Hobb, greets Walter with the easy familiarity of two men who have done business together for years. Grain goes in one end of the process and flour comes out the other, and the mechanism connecting the two, gears and grinding stones turning in careful coordination, strikes Robin as something close to magic, though his father explains it patiently, as he explains most things, in plain practical terms that strip away the mystery without entirely killing the wonder of it. Payment for the milling does not happen in coin, not for a family like this one. Instead, the miller takes a portion of the flour itself as his fee, a customary share that everyone in the village understands and generally accepts as fair, though Robin has heard, more than once, older villagers grumbling good-naturedly about millers in general having a reputation, deserved or not, for taking a slightly heavier portion than strictly agreed whenever they think nobody is watching closely enough to notice. Walter only laughs at this when Robin repeats it to him on the walk home, and says that every trade has its version of that particular complaint, and that a wise man simply keeps a rough count of what goes in and what comes back, which Walter, Robin notices with quiet admiration, always seems to do without any visible effort at all. They walk home with the flour secured in a sack across Walter's shoulder, the short afternoon light already beginning its now familiar early retreat, and Robin tired in the particular satisfied way of a child who has been included in something real, asks his father a string of questions about mills and rivers and whether the water ever truly freezes solid enough to walk across, questions Walter answers patiently, one after another, all the way back to the cottage, where the smell of Edith's cooking reaches them from 20 paces off and pulls Robin the last stretch of the walk at something close to a run. Not every day passes without its small worries, and one arrives on a grey morning in late January when Edith notices the goat standing oddly in the corner of the byre, off her feed and unwilling to be touched along one side in the way she normally welcomes. Edith's stomach tightens at the sight of it, because whatever concern she might have for the animal's own sake sits alongside the harder, more practical fear that runs underneath every winter in this household, the knowledge of exactly how much this family depends on that one animal's continued good health. She kneels beside the goat, ignoring the cold seeping up through the straw and into her knees, and runs careful hands along her flank, checking for heat or swelling, murmuring low and steady the whole time in the particular voice she uses for anything frightened, human or animal alike. She finds nothing alarming. In the end, only a mild stiffness that she suspects comes from an awkward night spent lying against the cold stone foundation, rather than the softer straw bedding, easily enough remedied by fresh bedding and a warming mash of grain, mixed with a little of her own herbal knowledge stirred in for good measure. Feverfew again, in a smaller and different preparation than the one she keeps for her own family's headaches. By the following morning the goat is back to her usual self, nosing hopefully at Edith's apron for treats, and the whole small crisis passes without ever growing into anything worse. But Edith notices, in the hours between first spotting the problem and confirming it was nothing serious, exactly how much of her own steadiness had been quietly, carefully managed rather than simply felt. This is a truth she has learnt to live with over the years, without ever quite growing used to it, the way the whole architecture of the family's survival can seem to balance, in certain anxious moments, on the health of one modest animal who has no idea at all how much is riding on her. Agnes, for her part, gets one more small chapter in her slow, careful story with Hal before the month is out, when his family's holding sends word that they have more honey than usual to trade this year, and Edith, recognizing an opportunity when she sees one, though she would never admit to engineering it quite so deliberately, sends Agnes herself to make the exchange rather than going in person. Agnes walks the distance with her heart beating a little faster than the errand strictly warrants, and finds Hal himself tending the hive's winter coverings when she arrives, breath visible in the cold as he works. They talk for perhaps 10 minutes about nothing of any real consequence, about the bees and how they survive the winter clustered together for warmth inside their skeps, in a manner Agnes finds she cannot stop thinking about later, an image of hundreds of small bodies pressed close together for shared survival that strikes her, without her quite being able to say why, as unexpectedly moving. Hal walks her part way back down the lane when the exchange is finished, further than strictly necessary, and says, just before turning back, that he hopes she will be at the next gathering the village holds, whenever that turns out to be. Agnes spends the rest of the walk home in a state of quiet, private happiness she does not fully share with anyone, though her mother, watching her daughter's face as she comes through the door, requires no explanation at all to understand exactly what kind of afternoon it has been. There is a custom this village keeps that Robin loves more than almost any other winter event, stranger and louder than anything else the season offers, and it falls on the 12th night itself, layered into the same evening as the games and the visiting, though it happens separately, out among the village's small collection of fruit trees, rather than inside any single household. This is the wassailing of the orchard, and the first time a very young Robin witnessed it he was frightened half out of his wits before he understood what was actually happening, and now, 3 or 4 years older and considerably wiser in the ways of village tradition, he counts it among his favourite parts of the entire season. A small procession forms after dark, torches and lanterns held aloft, moving out to where the village's apple trees stand bare and skeletal against the winter sky, and there, gathered around the oldest and most productive of the trees, the villagers make what looks, to an outsider, like a tremendous amount of deliberate noise, banging pots and pans together, shouting and singing verses meant specifically to wake the tree from its winter sleep and frighten off whatever evil spirits might otherwise threaten the coming year's harvest. Someone pours a little of last autumn's cider onto the tree's roots, an offering meant to encourage a generous crop to come, and pieces of toasted bread soaked in cider are sometimes hung in the branches themselves, an offering as much to the robins and other birds thought to represent the good spirits of the orchard as to the tree. Nobody in the crowd, not even the oldest villagers who have performed this exact ritual every year of their long lives, could tell you with any real confidence how far back the custom stretches, or whether it does anything at all beyond the simple pleasure of a whole community making joyful noise together in the middle of a cold, dark night. Walter, when Robin asked him directly once whether he believed it truly worked, gave an answer that has stuck with the boy ever since, that it hardly mattered whether the trees could hear them, because the noise and the company and the shared hope of it were worth doing regardless, and that a good harvest the following autumn would be welcome whether the wassailing helped bring it about, or simply happened to coincide with it. This is, in its own way, a small window into how this family and this whole village hold their beliefs, a comfortable, practical blend of solemn church teaching and older, half-remembered custom that nobody troubles themselves to fully reconcile, because both, in their different ways, offer something the winter truly calls for, structure and hope and an excuse, now and then, to gather together and make a joyful noise against the dark. February arrives quietly, without any single dramatic marker beyond the calendar itself, though Edith notices it first in the smallest of ways, a slight lengthening of the daylight that would be imperceptible to anyone not watching for it as closely as she does every year, a few extra minutes of pale grey light lingering at the edges of the morning and evening that were simply not there just weeks before. She mentions it to Walter almost as soon as she notices it, and he nods without much visible reaction, though she knows he has been tracking the same small shift himself in his own quiet way, gauging it against the position of sunrise over a particular tree on the eastern horizon that has served as his own informal calendar for as long as he has worked this land. Candlemas falls in the first days of the month, the church feast marking the presentation of the infant Christ in the temple, but carrying alongside its religious meaning a far more practical significance for households like this one, functioning as the informal midpoint marker of winter itself, the day by which, tradition holds, half the season's stores of food and fuel should still remain if a household is to make it comfortably through to spring. Edith performs her accounting on this day with more formality than her usual daily glances toward the storage pit, actually counting now, tallying the remaining sacks of grain against the weeks still ahead, checking the salt pork barrels level, counting the split logs still stacked in the byre. The reckoning comes back favourable, as she suspected it would, the family's careful autumn preparation and steady winter discipline having done exactly what they were meant to do, and she allows herself a small private satisfaction at the sight of the numbers working out as planned, though she says nothing overly triumphant about it to Walter beyond a simple, quiet confirmation that they are well positioned for whatever remains of the cold months. There is an old rhyme the village women trade among themselves around this exact time of year, warning that if Candlemas Day comes fair and bright, winter will take another flight, lingering longer than anyone would like, while a Candlemas of clouds and storm promises an early spring instead, and this year the day dawns grey and heavy with a promise of more snow before nightfall, which Edith takes, along with everyone else in the village, as a small hopeful sign, however unscientific the reasoning behind it might actually be. There is another quieter significance to this particular point in the calendar too, one that touches Edith more personally than the grain counts do. It was around this same season 17 years ago now that her own mother first grew seriously ill with the sickness that would, by the following winter, take her for good, and Edith finds herself every year at this exact turning point, thinking of her a little more often than usual, not with fresh grief exactly, that particular sharp edge having worn smooth over the intervening years, but with a kind of settled, familiar tenderness, the way you might return to a well-loved object simply to hold it again for a while before setting it back down. She does not mention this to anyone, not even Walter, who nonetheless notices, as he has noticed every year around this same time, without ever quite naming it aloud, that his wife grows a shade quieter for a day or two in early February and responds to it the way he has learnt to respond to most of Edith's private moods over 15 years of marriage, not by prying, but simply by staying close, finding small reasons to sit near her by the fire a little longer than strictly necessary, letting his presence say what neither of them feels any particular need to put into words. The weeks following Candlemas settle into what Edith privately thinks of as the long middle stretch of true winter, the part of the season without any feast day to break it up, without any obvious marker beyond the slow, patient accumulation of ordinary days, each looking very much like the one before it. This is, in its own way, the truest test of the whole household's preparation, this unglamorous middle distance where the novelty of the season's beginning has long since worn off, and its end still feels impossibly far away. And it asks of the family not any single dramatic effort, but simply the willingness to keep doing, day after day, the same steady small tasks that have carried them this far already. Walter's days settle into a rhythm built around tool maintenance and the slow ongoing work of preparing for spring, even while spring itself remains weeks away, mending harnesses, checking the plough one more time, splitting and stacking wood against the last of the winter's needs, and on clearer days, walking the boundaries of the family's strips simply to assess, with the practiced eye of a man who has done this every year of his working life, how the frozen ground is holding, and how soon it might begin to soften enough for the first tentative work of the new agricultural year to begin. There is a particular afternoon, well into February now, when he comes back inside from one of these boundary walks, with something small cupped carefully in one broad palm, and holds it out for Robin to see before anyone else. A single cluster of snowdrops, pale and improbably delicate against the rough weathered skin of his hand, found growing in a sheltered hollow at the base of the old boundary oak, where a little warmth seems to gather even in the depths of winter. Robin examines them with the same careful seriousness he brings to most small wonders, and Edith, glancing over from her weaving, feels something in her chest loosen slightly at the sight of them, the first physical proof in weeks that the whole vast machinery of the seasons is still turning as it should, however invisible its progress has felt through the recent grinding stretch of grey, undifferentiated days. Snowdrops mean something specific and hopeful in a household like this one, a signal understood without needing to be explained that the very deepest part of winter has truly passed now, even if real warmth remains a distant promise rather than a present fact. The ground beneath the snow is beginning, in its own invisible way, to stir again, and though more hard frosts will surely arrive before spring properly settles in, More cold mornings and possibly even more snow. The absolute bottom of the year's cycle has been reached and passed, and everything from here forward moves, however slowly and however invisibly for now, back toward light. Edith takes the small cluster of flowers and sets them carefully in a cup of water on the shelf near the hearth, a small fragile decoration entirely unlike anything else in the practical, working household, and for the next several days the family finds themselves glancing at it more often than such a small thing would seem to warrant, a quiet reminder sitting in plain sight that endurance, however long and however grey, does eventually give way to something else. The family's small flock of sheep, kept mostly for their wool rather than their meat, occupies a good deal of Walter's attention through these later weeks of winter, since the ewes are due to begin lambing before winter has properly finished its retreat, a timing that always strikes outsiders as strange until they understand the reasoning behind it. Lambs born in late winter or earliest spring have the whole of the growing season ahead of them to gain strength before facing their own first winter, a calculation shepherds across the centuries have understood instinctively, even without any formal science, to explain exactly why it works out better this way. Walter checks the small flock daily now, walking out in whatever weather the morning offers to where they shelter in a rough enclosure at the edge of the holding, counting them, watching for the particular signs of an approaching birth that his own father taught him to recognize decades ago, a certain restlessness in a ew's movements, a certain way she holds herself apart from the rest of the flock. Nothing has happened yet, not this week, but the watching itself has become part of the daily rhythm, a task layered onto everything else the season already demands, and Robin has taken to accompanying his father on these checks whenever his own morning chores allow, hoping, with the particular impatience of an 8-year-old anticipating something exciting, to be present for the actual moment a first lamb arrives. Time itself, in this household and this village, gets measured by means that would strike a modern person as impossibly imprecise, and yet serve this family's needs perfectly well. There is no clock in the cottage, no clock anywhere in the village beyond, perhaps a rough sundial mounted on the south wall of the church, useless in any case through these overcast winter months when the sun rarely shows itself clearly enough to cast a reliable shadow. Instead, the day organizes itself around the canonical hours marked by the distant ringing of the church bell, calling the faithful to prayer at set points from before dawn until after dark, a sound that carries across the fields and reaches even this isolated holding clearly enough to serve as the village's shared, informal clock. Beyond the bell, time is simply light itself, and task, and hunger, and the particular quality of the sky at any given moment, a way of living inside the day, rather than merely measuring it, that a modern person, accustomed to checking a clock face dozens of times, without truly looking at the sky at all, might find, if they tried it honestly for even a single day, surprisingly difficult to fully inhabit. The first lamb of the season arrives, as these things often seem to, in the middle of a perfectly ordinary morning with no particular warning beyond what Walter's practiced eye had already noted the evening before, a certain restlessness in one particular ewe that told him, with reasonable confidence, that today would likely be the day. He brings Robin along this time, true to his earlier promise, and the two of them find the ewe already well along, settled in the most sheltered corner of the enclosure, and Walter crouches nearby, close enough to help if help becomes necessary, but far enough back to let the animal's own instincts do the greater part of the work uninterrupted. Robin watches with wide, serious eyes, some of his usual restless energy stilled entirely by the gravity of what he is witnessing, and within what feels to him like both a very long time and hardly any time at all, a small wet shape arrives into the cold morning air, impossibly delicate, and the ewe turns immediately to it, nosing and licking with an urgency that looks, even to an 8-year-old, unmistakably like love. Walter moves in only briefly, checking that the lamb is breathing properly and positioned to nurse, and steps back again just as quickly, satisfied that mother and newborn will manage the rest between themselves. "That is it," he tells Robin quietly, watching the wobbling, impossibly thin legs find their footing for the first time. "That is the whole world right there." Robin does not entirely understand what his father means by this. Not yet, though he will turn the phrase over in his mind more than once in the years ahead. gradually growing into its full meaning the way a person grows into a garment bought slightly too large on purpose. For now he simply watches, delighted, as the lamb manages its first uncertain steps, and asks his father a dozen questions in rapid succession about how soon it will be able to run, whether it will remember this exact spot, whether they might name it. Questions Walter answers patiently, one after another, in the unhurried voice of a man entirely at ease with the particular miracle currently unfolding a few feet in front of him. News of the first lamb travels quickly enough through the small holding and reaches Edith before Walter and Robin themselves make it back to the cottage, carried by Agnes, who had gone out earlier to check the hedge line and spotted her father and brother crouched together at the enclosure from a distance, guessing correctly what it meant. By the time the two of them do return, stamping cold from their boots and grinning in a way that mirrors each other so closely it makes Edith laugh outright, she already has a warm drink waiting, and the whole family spends a few minutes simply basking in the small, uncomplicated good news of it. A single new life safely arrived into a household that has spent months now carefully managing the continuation of every other life already in its keeping. Later that same week, with a stretch of milder weather having softened the worst of the ice on the roads, Walter makes the journey to the market town some 5 miles distant, a trip too far and too uncertain to risk during the harder weeks of deep winter, but manageable now with reasonable care. He takes Agnes with him this time, her first such trip in nearly 2 months, both of them wrapped heavily against the lingering cold, and walking rather than riding, since the family owns no horse, only the goat and the small flock of sheep and the 2 hens, animals suited to a modest holding's daily needs rather than to travel. The market town, when they finally reach it after the long walk, feels almost overwhelming after weeks of the quiet, contained world of the village. Stalls and voices, and the press of considerably more people gathered in one place than Agnes has seen since before Christmas, and she stays close to her father's side, taking in the noise and colour of it with the particular wide-eyed attention of someone who has been living quite happily inside a much smaller world for a good while now. Coin changes hands here in a way it rarely does back in the village, though even here a great deal of the actual business happens through barter and credit rather than hard currency. A farmer trading a portion of stored grain for a length of iron for a new tool, a weaver exchanging cloth for leather, coin itself remaining a properly scarce commodity in a rural economy like this one, hoarded carefully and spent only when nothing else will serve the purpose. Walter trades a portion of their surplus wool, more than the family needs for its own weaving this year thanks to a good shearing back in the autumn, for a small quantity of salt, always valuable and never quite abundant enough, and for a new iron blade to replace one on his plough that has worn thinner than he would like to trust through another full planting season. Agnes, meanwhile, is given a rare small coin of her own to spend however she likes, an indulgence her father allows perhaps twice a year, and she spends a long, deliciously indecisive quarter hour weighing her options among the stalls before finally choosing a small twist of dried ginger, a genuine luxury for a household like theirs, imagining already the particular warm sweetness it will add to the family's pottage on some especially cold evening still to come. The walk home takes longer than the walk there, both of them tired now and the light beginning its early retreat. But Agnes finds herself unexpectedly happy for most of it, full of small observations about the things she saw and heard in town, and Walter listens to her chatter with the quiet, contented attention of a father who recognizes, without needing to name it explicitly, that his daughter is changing, growing outward into a wider world a little at a time, and that these small excursions matter more than either of them would think to say aloud. That evening, with the ginger unwrapped and shaved carefully into the evening's pottage, the whole cottage fills with a warm, spiced smell entirely different from its usual daily scent, and Robin declares predictably that this is now without question his favourite meal of all time, a title Agnes points out, with the weary patience of an older sibling, he awards to something new roughly twice a week, though even she cannot help agreeing that the ginger has transformed the familiar stew into something worth savouring slowly rather than simply eating out of habit. It is on this same evening, with the small luxury of the ginger still warm in everyone's memory, that Edith finally settles the question she has been quietly turning over for weeks now, ever since the night of the difficult birth, and Agnes's unspoken longing afterward to understand more of what her mother carries in that small herbal basket. She waits until Robin has drifted off to sleep and Walter has settled into his own evening mending, and asks Agnes, quietly, whether she would still like to begin learning properly, not just watching from the edges as she has done her whole childhood, but actually being taught, the way Edith herself was taught by her own mother, plant by plant, remedy by remedy, across the slow accumulating years it takes to build this kind of knowledge properly. Agnes's answer comes without a single moment's hesitation, a yes so immediate and so certain that it makes Edith laugh softly despite the seriousness of the moment, and something settles in her chest as she says it, a decision that has been in truth years in the making finally given its proper shape and voice. She explains carefully the same things her own mother once explained to her, that this knowledge carries real value alongside real responsibility, that it must be held with care, offered generously to those in real need but never worn as a badge, or spoken of carelessly among those who might misunderstand its nature, and Agnes listens to all of it with the same grave seriousness she brought to the moment of the lamb's birth weeks before, understanding, in her own 12-year-old way, that she is being handed something that matters. They begin that very night, in fact, with something small and low stakes, Edith showing her daughter exactly how to identify the dried feverfew in the herb bundle by touch and smell alone, in the dark if necessary, since a mother called out to help a labouring neighbour in the deep of night rarely has the luxury of good light to work by. Agnes's fingers are clumsy at first, uncertain, but Edith recognises in her daughter's careful, determined attention the same hunger to learn that she once brought to her own mother's knee, decades and what feels now like several whole lifetimes ago, and there is something in watching that inheritance take root right here in front of her that feels to Edith like one of the truest, quietest joys the whole long winter has offered her yet. There is a particular truth about this stretch of the calendar, the weeks between Candlemas and the true return of spring, that the older villagers speak of more openly than the younger ones tend to, a recognition that this final stretch of winter asks more careful management than any other, precisely because the autumn's abundance has thinned considerably by now, while the first fresh growth of the new season remains still weeks away. Some call this coming stretch the hungry gap, though in a household as carefully prepared as this one, the name carries more caution than genuine fear, a reminder to keep portions sensible and stores watched closely, rather than any real anticipation of true want. Edith adjusts the household's meals accordingly through these weeks, stretching the remaining grain a little further, leaning more heavily on the preserved eggs and the last of the hard cheese, watching the salt pork barrel's dwindling level with the same careful attention she has paid it since the season began. Nothing about this adjustment feels desperate or grim to the family living through it. It is simply the next phase of the same careful discipline that has carried them this far, a tightening rather than a crisis, the kind of prudent management that a well-run household treats as entirely ordinary business, rather than any cause for alarm. Old Marjorie, the widow Edith spoke with at the mill pond weeks before, a woman whose own 5 children are long grown now and scattered across neighbouring holdings of their own, stops by one afternoon with a story of her own about a particularly hard version of this exact stretch, some 15 years back now, when a late heavy frost damaged much of the region's stored grain, and the whole village had to lean harder than usual on shared resources and mutual generosity to see everyone through to the first reliable spring growth. She tells it not as a cautionary tale meant to frighten, but almost as a point of quiet pride, an example of the village's own resilience, the way neighbours pulled what they had and made certain nobody went truly without, and Edith finds herself, listening to it, feeling a fresh appreciation for the particular kind of community she has married into, one tested by real hardship in living memory and found, when it mattered most, to hold. "We have never had a winter beat us yet," Marjorie says, with the simple confidence of a woman who has personally outlasted more than 60 of them, and Edith finds herself believing it completely, not as a boast but as a plain statement of accumulated fact, the kind of truth a person earns the right to say only after enough years of proving it. Back near the very start of the year, on the Monday following Twelfth Night, the village had marked what everyone called Plough Monday, the traditional day when agricultural work was meant, at least symbolically, to resume after the long Christmas rest, though the ground itself remained far too frozen for any actual ploughing to begin in earnest. The custom instead involved a good deal of cheerful theatre, young men of the village hauling a plough from house to house in a kind of procession, collecting small offerings of food or coin at each stop in exchange for a blessing on the coming year's harvest, all of it accompanied by considerably more noise and laughter than the solemnity of the stated purpose would seem to warrant. Walter had contributed his own small offering at the door that day, a portion of bread and a cup of the household's ale, and watched the procession move on to the next holding with the same fond, slightly bemused expression he brings to most of the village's more theatrical traditions, understanding perfectly well that the actual agricultural year would begin whenever the ground itself decided it was ready, regardless of any procession's timing, but valuing the custom anyway for what it truly offered, a shared, hopeful marker that the working year was turning again, even while the coldest weeks still lay ahead. Now, weeks later, with that same ground finally beginning to show the first genuine signs of softening underfoot in sheltered, sun-warmed corners, the memory of Plough Monday's hopeful theatre feels less like empty custom and more like accurate prophecy. Walter walks his fields more often now, testing the soil with an experienced thumb pressed into the ground at various points, gauging how much longer the true thaw might take, and though he knows better than to expect it any earlier than it actually arrives, he finds himself, on these walks, allowing himself small private anticipations of the planting season ahead, calculating rough plans for which strips will take which crops this coming year, a kind of hopeful mental work that the deepest weeks of winter never quite permitted him the confidence to indulge in. One morning, walking the boundary near the old oak where the snowdrops first appeared weeks before, he hears, for the first time this year, the unmistakable clear song of an actual robin somewhere in the bare branches above him, and stops walking entirely for a long moment just to listen, struck, as he is every single year despite having heard this exact small herald announce the same seasonal turn more times than he could count, by how much hope a few notes of birdsong can carry when they arrive after a long enough silence. Agnes's lessons with her mother continue steadily through these final weeks of true winter, a little each evening, sometimes only a few minutes, sometimes a longer stretch when the day's other work allows for it. She learns to distinguish by smell alone with her eyes closed the difference between 3 separate dried herbs that look nearly identical in the low firelight, a skill that frustrates her considerably at first, and then, quite suddenly one evening, simply clicks into place, her nose and fingers together somehow cataloguing distinctions her conscious mind could not have described in words even a day before. She learns, too, the harder lessons that come alongside the practical skills, the ones about discretion and judgment that her mother is even more careful to pass along than the herbal knowledge itself. Edith tells her one evening about a woman she knew in her own girlhood village, gifted with real skill in healing but careless about how visibly she used it, who found herself in a hard year when sickness swept through and her remedies could not save everyone who came to her, the target of whispers that grew uglier than anyone should have allowed, whispers that never fully resolved into anything worse but that shadowed the woman's remaining years regardless. Agnes listens to this story with the particular solemnity she brings to anything her mother tells her in this careful, private register, understanding that she is being handed not just a skill, but a whole way of carrying that skill safely through the world. The gift is real, Edith tells her, and so is the danger in it. You hold both at once. That is simply how it is. Agnes nods, and though she is only 12 and cannot yet fully weigh everything those words will come to mean across the years ahead of her, she carries them anyway, tucked away alongside the growing store of practical knowledge, the way a person carries a warning they have not yet needed but knows, somehow, they eventually will. Robin, meanwhile, has grown through this winter in ways less deliberate than his sister's, but no less real. Taller by a noticeable measure since the season began, steadier in his chores, capable now of tasks that would have overwhelmed him back in the autumn. Edith notices it most clearly in small moments, the way he handles the kindling basket now without needing reminding to fill it properly, the way he checked on the newborn lamb this week with a gentleness that surprised her, given how much noisy chaos he usually brings to everything he touches. Winter has a way of doing this to children, she thinks, watching him from across the room one evening, asking so much steady daily labor of them that they grow into its demands almost without anyone quite noticing the growing happening, until one day the child who could barely fill a kindling basket without half of it spilling is suddenly, somehow, someone genuinely useful to the whole household's survival. Walter, for his part, spends less time than his wife or daughter on any explicit reflection about the winter's meaning, being a man more comfortable expressing such things through action than through words. But there is a particular evening, late in this final stretch of the cold season, when something close to reflection does surface in him anyway, prompted by nothing more dramatic than the simple act of running his hand along the worn wooden handle of the same axe his own father used before him, and his father's father before that, 3 generations of the same calloused grip, wearing the same small smooth hollow into the same length of ashwood. He mentions this briefly to Edith that night, not as any grand philosophical statement, but almost as an aside, that he wonders sometimes whether Robin will hold this same handle himself one day, worn a little smoother still by another lifetime's use, and whether the boy will think, in whatever moment prompts the thought, of his own father the way Walter now thinks of his. Edith, hearing this rare unguarded moment from a man not given to voicing such things aloud, reaches over and takes his hand, the one that has held that axe handle through 20 winters now, and says only that she thinks Robin will remember more than Walter perhaps gives him credit for, remembers already, at 8 years old, more of his father's careful, patient teaching than either of them might fully realize yet. It occurs to Walter, turning the axe handle over once more in the firelight before setting it back in its place, that this whole household, this whole careful architecture of survival and warmth and small daily labor that the family has built and rebuilt every single winter of his adult life, is itself a kind of inheritance passed forward exactly the way that axe handle has been passed forward, not as a single dramatic gift, but as 1,000 small transmitted habits, the way to bank a fire, the way to read an approaching storm, the way to know exactly how much grain remains against exactly how many weeks of winter still lie ahead. None of it announces itself as legacy while it is happening. It simply happens, day after ordinary day, until one day the children who absorbed it are grown, and pass it on in turn to children of their own, and the whole long chain continues forward, mostly invisible, entirely essential, the same way it has continued forward for longer than anyone in this village could accurately trace. The days continue their slow, steady lengthening, each one carrying just a little more usable light than the one before it, and the whole village seems, by unspoken collective agreement, to lean a little further out of its winter posture with every passing week, doors propped open a while longer during the mildest hours, more voices carrying across the green as neighbours linger a little longer in conversation than the coldest weeks ever permitted. Edith notices it in her own household too, a certain loosening, Robin spending longer stretches outside now that the worst of the cold has eased. Agnes is spinning, slowing not from any lessening of skill, but simply because there is, for the first time in months, slightly less pressing urgency behind the work, the deep well of winter idleness that textile labour was meant to fill beginning, gradually, to shrink as outdoor tasks reclaim more of the available daylight. There remains, even so, real work ahead before spring can be called properly arrived, and the family does not mistake these hopeful early signs for permission to rest entirely. Walter continues his daily rounds of the flock, now considerably busier, with 3 more lambs having arrived in the days since the first, each birth a little less nerve-wracking than the one before it, the whole household settling into the particular confident rhythm that comes from having successfully weathered the anxious uncertainty of a first attempt. The storage pit beneath the byre floor grows steadily leaner with each passing week, exactly as expected, exactly as planned for, the family's careful autumn foresight proving itself, once again, entirely equal to the season's demands. A lightness settles into the cottage now that was not quite present even a month before, not because the hard work of winter has ended, since it has not truly, not for weeks yet, but because the shape of the season has become visible at last, its ending no longer an abstract hope, but a real, approaching certainty, close enough now to plan around rather than merely endure. Edith finds herself humming more often at her weaving, small unconscious fragments of the same old seasonal songs the family sings together some evenings, and Walter, coming in from the byre one particularly mild afternoon, pauses at the doorway just to listen to her for a moment before announcing himself, struck, as he sometimes still is after 15 years of marriage, by how much he loves the ordinary sound of his own wife's unguarded voice filling their small home. One particular evening, near the very end of this long winter's stretch, that stays with the whole family afterward as something like a small private landmark, though nothing about it, on the surface, differs greatly from 100 other evenings that came before it. It begins the way most evenings begin, supper eaten together by firelight, the day's small news traded back and forth the way it always is, but something in the quality of the light lingering a little longer than usual outside the shuttered window gives the whole evening a particular unhurried sweetness that everyone in the room seems to feel without needing to remark on it directly. Walter brings out his carved pipe, not something he does every week even now, and plays through 2 or 3 of the old familiar tunes, while Edith hums along, and Robin, sprawled on the floor near the fire in the boneless way he has claimed as his own posture all winter, taps out something like rhythm against the packed earth with one bare foot. Agnes works a little more of her mother's herb bundle into recognition by touch, eyes closed, getting 3 correct in a row now, a small private triumph she does not announce aloud, but that Edith notices anyway, and rewards with nothing more than a small proud smile that says everything it needs to without a single word. At some point, without any of them quite deciding to do it on purpose, the conversation turns backward, the way it sometimes does on an evening with this particular unhurried quality, each of them offering up some small favourite memory from the winter now nearly behind them. Robin, predictably, chooses the lamb's birth, describing it again in exactly the same breathless detail he has used at least a dozen times already, as though the retelling itself were part of the pleasure. Agnes mentions, more quietly, the night she first correctly named an herb in the dark, and glances at her mother while she says it, a small private exchange passing between them that neither Walter nor Robin fully catches, though Walter, watching it happen, has a fairly good guess at its shape regardless. Edith, when her turn comes, surprises herself slightly by choosing not any single dramatic moment, but simply this, an ordinary evening much like this very one, weeks ago now, lying awake in the deep stillness of the coldest night of the whole season, listening to her family breathe around her, feeling entirely, solidly held inside a small warm world, standing firm against an enormous cold one. Walter, hearing her describe it, reaches over without a word and takes her hand again, the same gesture from that same remembered night, and for a moment the whole small cottage seems to hold something larger than its actual modest walls could reasonably contain. 4 lives woven together through one more long winter, safely, warmly, completely. Cheese-making occupies a fair and steady portion of Edith's attention through these final weeks too, a task tied directly to the goat's milk production, which has been building steadily now that the animal, like the rest of the world around her, seems to sense the turning of the season in her own body's rhythms. Edith works the curds by hand in a shallow wooden bowl, separating them carefully from the whey, a process she learnt as a girl and has performed so many hundreds of times since that her hands move through it with barely any conscious thought required, pressing and turning and salting lightly before setting the fresh curds into a cloth-lined mould to firm. This particular batch will not be ready for weeks yet, aging slowly in the coolest corner of the byre, wrapped and turned regularly to develop the sharp, crumbling character that the family's cheese always eventually takes on. But Edith finds a genuine satisfaction in starting it anyway, one more small deposit into the household's ongoing account of stored, patient abundance. Robin hovers nearby throughout the process, as he always does, hoping for a taste of the fresh curds before they go into the mould. A small treat Edith allows him more often than she probably should, mostly because his delight in it never seems to diminish no matter how many times he has already had exactly this same simple pleasure. The roof, too, gets one more careful inspection before the season fully turns, Walter climbing a rough ladder on a calm, dry afternoon to check the thatch for any sections that winter's weight and weather might have loosened or thinned, patching 2 small spots near the ridge with fresh reed bundled and worked in with the same careful technique his own father taught him, a skill that takes years to do well and that Walter has, by now, thoroughly mastered through long practice. Robin watches from below, forbidden from climbing up himself, but clearly itching to, and Walter promises, as he has promised for the past 2 summers running, that he will begin teaching him the proper technique once he is a little older and a little steadier on a ladder, a promise Robin holds on to with the fierce, patient hope of a boy counting down years he cannot yet fully comprehend the length of. Lent brings one more notable stretch to the church calendar before winter can be called properly finished, the season of Lent approaching now, with its weeks of simplified eating, less meat and richer foods than the rest of the year permits, a practice that a household like this one experiences with rather less hardship than city dwellers might, given how much of their own winter diet already leans towards simple grain and preserved vegetables regardless of any religious calendar's instruction. Edith adjusts the coming week's meals accordingly, more of the dried peas and less of the remaining salt pork, a shift that feels in this particular household less like deprivation and more like a natural continuation of the careful rationing the whole winter has already demanded. There is a kind of cleaning that happens around this same stretch too, not the thorough seasonal scouring that will come later with the true arrival of spring and the ability to fling doors and windows properly open to air the whole cottage through, but a smaller version of it, rushes on the floor swept out and replaced with a fresh layer, the accumulated dust and ash of winter's constant fire cleared from every surface it has settled on, a small domestic renewal that Edith performs every year around roughly this same point in the calendar, an instinct passed down without any formal reasoning attached to it, beyond the simple, sound observation that a home benefits from occasionally being shaken awake from its own long winter stillness. Agnes helps with this task more capably than she has in winters past, old enough now to manage the heavier work of turning and airing the bedding, beating dust from the woolen blankets outside in the mild afternoon air, work that leaves her arms tired in a satisfying way by the day's end. Robin, given the smaller task of sweeping the old rushes out through the low door, makes considerably more mess of it than help, scattering half of what he is meant to be gathering, and Edith lets it go with the particular indulgent patience she reserves specifically for her son's earnest, chaotic efforts, knowing that competence in a boy like this one arrives eventually and does not need to be rushed toward through excessive correction. By the time the fresh rushes are down and the cottage smells, once again, of that faint sweet green scent that always accompanies the change, Edith stands for a moment in the middle of her own small, well-tended home, and feels something close to quiet triumph, not loud or announced, simply the settled satisfaction of a woman who has once again carried her household safely through the hardest stretch of the year's long turning wheel. It is on one of these final evenings of the true winter season, with the fresh rushes still holding their faint green scent underfoot, and the days now noticeably longer than they were even a fortnight before, that the whole household settles into what will become, though none of them know it yet, one of the last truly quiet nights of this particular shape before spring's returning work reclaims the family's evenings for other purposes entirely. Supper is simple again tonight, more of the dwindling pottage, softened bread, a sliver of the last hard cheese from autumn's batch, but nobody minds the plainness of it, each of them carrying in their own way the particular contentment that comes from knowing exactly how much longer this careful rationing needs to hold, and trusting, from long practice now, that it will. Walter banks the fire a little differently tonight than he has through the coldest weeks, needing slightly less fuel to see the household comfortably through, until morning now that the deepest cold has truly eased, and there is something almost ceremonial in the small adjustment, a quiet acknowledgement, made without any words exchanged about it, that the season has shifted meaningfully, even if real warmth remains still some weeks distant. Robin, worn out from a full day spent mostly outdoors now that the ground allows for it, drifts towards sleep earlier than his usual evening resistance would suggest, curled on the floor near the fire for a while, before Edith gently steers him behind the hurdle screen toward the bed proper. Agnes stays up a little longer, working one more small lesson with her mother, correctly identifying, this time without any hesitation at all, 4 separate dried herbs by scent alone in the dim firelight, a small milestone that makes Edith's chest tighten with a pride she does not entirely trust herself to put into words without her voice catching slightly. When Agnes finally does retire, tired and pleased with herself in the quiet, contained way she has always carried her satisfactions, Edith remains by the fire a while longer with Walter, the two of them sitting in the comfortable, unhurried silence that 15 years of marriage has taught them how to inhabit without any need to fill it with conversation. Walter says it first. Another one behind us, not quite a question, and Edith knows exactly what he means without needing further explanation. Another full winter successfully carried, another season's careful preparation proven equal to its task, another turn of the same old wheel that has carried families like theirs through this same cycle for longer than either of them could accurately trace backward. Another one behind us, she agrees in turn, and reaches for his hand one more time before the fire burns down low enough to need its final banking for the night. She performs the snoring ritual one more time before finally rising from her stool, the same careful raking back of ash, the same gentle mounding of the living embers beneath their protective grey coat, the same trust, worn comfortable now by countless repetitions across 15 winters in this exact house, that something small and nearly invisible, tended correctly, will still be alive come morning. Her hands know this motion so thoroughly by now that she barely needs to watch them do it, muscle and memory together completing the task while her mind wanders, unhurried, back across the whole long season now drawing gently toward its close. Her mind moves first to the frost that sealed the mill pond back in late autumn, and of Robin's delighted shriek the first time he heard the ice groan and crack beneath careful testing weight. She thinks of Agnes at the well with Cecily, breath rising in visible clouds between bursts of easy laughter, and of the particular quality of hope in her daughter's face on the walk home from the honey exchange with Hal, a hope Edith recognizes now as the beginning of an entirely new chapter she will get to watch unfold, slowly, across the seasons still ahead. She thinks of Walter kneeling in the frozen field mending fence, of his hands steady and sure with the awl and thread by firelight, of the particular tenderness in his voice the evening he told Robin, watching the newborn lamb find its footing, that this was the whole world, right there. There is room, too, in this drifting recollection, for the herbs, for her own mother's hands sorting leaves by feel in a different cottage decades ago, and of Agnes's hands now, still clumsy but growing surer by the week, carrying that same inheritance forward into a future Edith cannot see the shape of yet, but trusts, the way she trusts the banked embers to hold through until morning will unfold exactly as it needs to. None of these memories arrive with any great drama attached to them. They simply surface, one after another, the way small stones surface in a familiar field after the frost has worked at the ground all winter, each one plain and solid and entirely her own, and by the time she finally crosses to the bed and slides in beside Walter, already half asleep, she carries all of them with her into the dark, not as a burden but as a kind of quiet wealth, the accumulated ordinary treasure of one more winter fully lived. Sleep does not come to her immediately, though it hovers close, the particular pleasant heaviness of a body that has worked hard and eaten enough and settled now into genuine warmth after a long day in a cold season. She lies still, listening to Walter's breathing slow and deepen beside her, to the faint rustle of Robin shifting behind the hurdle screen, to the goat settling her weight once more against the shared wall of the byre, and she finds herself thinking, in the loose, unguarded way thoughts move just before sleep finally claims a person, about how strange and how simple it is that a whole household's survival through the hardest months of the year comes down, in the end, to exactly this, small daily acts of care repeated without fail, tended the way she tends the fire itself, patiently, faithfully, trusting that what is banked carefully enough tonight will still be alive to build from again tomorrow. Somewhere beyond the shuttered window, the village sleeps too, each small household sealed into its own version of this same careful warmth, smoke rising in thin unseen threads from banked fires all along the lane, animals settled, stores counted, another ordinary night added to the long accumulating chain of nights that has carried this whole small community through more winters than anyone living could number precisely. There is no drama in it, there does not need to be. The whole quiet miracle of it lies exactly in its plainness, in ordinary people doing ordinary careful things, day after day after day, proving themselves equal to a season that could, without that care, prove dangerous, and doing it not once but every single year, as a simple, unremarkable matter of course. Edith's eyes grow heavier. Her hand, still loosely holding Walter's beneath the blankets, relaxes further into sleep's approach. The last coherent thought that crosses her mind before it finally lets go entirely is not about the herbs, or the stores, or even her children, though all of them drift somewhere nearby in the soft dissolving edges of her consciousness. It is simply this, plain and whole and entirely sufficient, that the fire is banked, that everyone she loves is breathing steadily nearby, and that morning, whenever it comes, will find this small warm household exactly as ready for it as it has always been. Morning arrives gently after that particular night, grey light seeping in around the edges of the shuttered window in its usual quiet way, but there is something different in the sound of the world outside today, a dripping, steady and persistent that takes Edith a moment to place correctly even after 15 years of learning to read this cottage's every seasonal signal. She rises and crosses to the door, easing it open just enough to look out, and finds the whole yard transformed overnight. Icicles that had hung rigid and glittering from the byre's eaves, now shedding themselves drop by drop into small dark pools forming beneath them, the crust of old snow gone soft and granular, sinking visibly even as she watches. The true thaw has arrived, not with any dramatic announcement, but simply overnight, the way these things so often seem to happen. Some invisible threshold of temperature finally crossed while the whole household slept unaware. Walter comes to stand beside her at the door, taking in the same dripping, softening yard, and there is a particular satisfaction in his face that Edith recognizes from every year they have shared this exact moment together, the quiet triumph of a farmer watching the ground itself finally signal its readiness for the work that has been waiting, patient and prepared, for months now. Robin bursts past both of them the moment he understands what has happened, delighted by the mud already forming at the yard's lowest point, and is called back twice before he has gone 3 steps, Edith's voice carrying the particular note of a mother who already knows exactly how this morning is going to end for her son's boots, regardless of anything she says now. Agnes follows more sedentally, standing at the threshold with her arms wrapped around herself against the lingering morning chill, watching a bird she does not recognize immediately, some early arrival newly returned to the district, hop along the softening ground in search of whatever the thaw has newly exposed. This is not spring itself, not yet, not fully. There will be more cold mornings before the season properly turns, more frost some nights even as the days grow steadily milder, the transition never quite as clean or as sudden as a single dramatic morning might suggest. But something has shifted decisively now, a threshold crossed that will not reverse itself again this year, and the whole family stands together for a few minutes at the open door, simply watching the yard drip and soften and slowly, unmistakably come back to life. Within the week, the ground has softened enough in the most favourable corners of the family's strips that Walter judges it finally ready for the first tentative turning of the season, and he brings out the plough he spent so many quiet winter afternoons maintaining, checking one final time that the blade sits true and the wooden frame holds sound before harnessing it to the borrowed ox that Walter shares, as he does every spring, with 2 neighbouring households in exactly the same kind of practical, unspoken arrangement that carried the community through the winter's harder moments. Robin walks alongside for the first pass, close enough to watch the dark, rich soil turn up in long, even furrows behind the blade, releasing a smell entirely different from anything the winter months offered, deep and earthy and somehow full of promise in a way that even an 8-year-old can sense without needing it explained to him. Walter lets him carry a small bag of seed for the earliest planting, wheat that will go into this newly turned ground within days now that the season has finally, unmistakably, tipped in the family's favour, and there is a particular symmetry in the sight of it that Edith notices from the cottage doorway, watching her husband and son cross the same field where, weeks before, Walter mended fence against a wind so bitter it had nearly frozen his own breath in the air before him. The whole village, in fact, seems to wake into this same renewed motion together, ploughs appearing across the open fields in every direction over these first mild days, voices calling back and forth between strips in a way that the quiet, contained winter months never quite permitted, the whole community's energy turning outward again after months spent turned carefully inward. Old Marjorie, walking the lane one afternoon on some errand of her own, pauses at the edge of the family's strip long enough to call out that this looks to be shaping into a fine spring, high praise from a woman who has personally judged more than 60 of them, and Walter calls back his thanks without breaking his steady rhythm behind the plough, grateful for the assessment but far more focused, in this exact moment, on the deeply satisfying work directly in front of him. Agnes finds herself with more reason to cross paths with Hal, now that the milder weather has loosened the whole village's winter caution, both of them included, along with a scattering of other young people from neighbouring holdings, in a small informal gathering one mild evening to celebrate the season's turning. Nothing so grand as the 12 days of Christmas, but festive enough in its own modest way, a fire built up on the village green itself, and voices carrying easily through air that no longer bites at exposed skin the way it did just weeks before. She lingers near the fire's edge for a while, in comfortable conversation with Cecily, before Hal drifts into the same small circle, and this time the conversation between them lasts considerably longer than the 10 careful minutes at the hives back in January, both of them a little easier now, a little more willing to let a silence stretch without immediately rushing to fill it, the particular comfortable quality of two people who have decided, without either quite announcing it aloud, that they like each other's company and intend to keep finding excuses to be in it. Edith, watching from a respectful distance where the adults have gathered around their own smaller fire, catches Walter's eye at one point and finds him already watching the same small scene with the same knowing, fond expression she suspects is mirrored on her own face. Walter watches too and says, quietly, not quite a complaint, "Growing up, that one," a note of something wistful underneath the plain observation. "Growing up all winter, really," Edith answers, thinking of the herbs, of the careful lessons in the firelight, of her daughter's steady, determined hands learning skills that will serve her for the whole of her life ahead. We simply noticed it happening, this time, while it was still happening, instead of only after. Walter considers this for a moment, watching Agnes laugh at something Hal has just said, and nods slowly, accepting the observation the way he accepts most of his wife's quieter insights, without argument, trusting that she has seen something true in it, even if he could not have named it so precisely himself. Robin, not to be outdone by his older sister's quiet triumphs, finds his own small milestone in these same mild spring evenings, when Walter finally judges him steady enough on the ladder to help with a properly useful task on the byre roof, nothing so delicate as full thatching work, which will wait for another year or two of growth and practice, but simple enough to trust to careful young hands, passing bundles of fresh reed up to his father and holding the ladder steady while Walter secures them in place. Robin approaches the task with a seriousness that would surprise anyone who has only seen his usual boundless, scattered energy, climbing the first few rungs with careful, deliberate hands, and beaming with a pride so large it seems barely containable when Walter tells him, afterward, that he did good, steady work up there. This is, Edith realizes, watching from below with her hand shading her eyes against the strengthening spring sun, the particular pleasure of a long winter well spent, not any single dramatic transformation but a whole accumulation of small ones, Robin steadier and more capable than the boy who could barely fill a kindling basket back in the season's first cold weeks, Agnes carrying real skill and real judgment now in the careful private inheritance her mother has begun passing forward to her, Walter himself no different in his fundamental nature, but perhaps, in these quiet unguarded moments, a shade more willing to let his family see the tenderness that has always run underneath his practical, steady exterior. She thinks, watching her son climb carefully back down the ladder into his father's waiting hands, that this is what a winter is actually for, beneath all its obvious practical demands of food and fuel and shelter carefully managed. It is a season that asks a family to turn inward for a while, to lean more heavily on each other than the busier months of the working year ever quite require, and if it is endured well, if it is met with the kind of patient, careful attention this household has brought to it across all its many weeks, it leaves behind not just survival, but something closer to genuine deepening, relationships tested gently and found, every single time, to hold. There is one more evening, near the very close of this long chronicle, worth lingering over before the story lets this family go. An evening much like countless others that came before it across the whole span of the winter, now finally, truly behind them, and yet somehow distinct for the particular stillness it carries, a kind of settled peace that only arrives after a long season successfully weathered. The fire burns low and steady in its familiar place at the centre of the room, no longer needing the careful, anxious rationing of the coldest weeks, fed now with a more generous hand since the woodpile, though diminished, need no longer stretch across an uncertain remaining distance. Edith sits at her loom, though not working with any great urgency tonight, more simply enjoying the familiar rhythm of the shuttle passing through the warp threads, a task she could perform in her sleep by now, and very nearly does on an evening as unhurried as this one. Walter mends nothing tonight, for once, sitting instead with his pipe silent in his lap, simply watching his family in the soft firelight, with the particular contentment of a man who has once again seen everyone he loves safely through to the other side of winter's long demands. Agnes works quietly at her herbs, no longer needing to close her eyes at all now to identify each one correctly by scent, and Robin, worn out from a full day spent largely outdoors in weather finally mild enough to permit real, unrestrained play, sleeps already, curled on the floor near the fire in the same boneless posture he has claimed as his own for the whole of this long season, one hand still loosely closed around a small carved wooden sheep Walter made him some weeks back, in the anxious days before the first lamb's uncertain arrival. Edith looks around the small warm room, at her sleeping son, at her daughter's steady, capable hands, at her husband's quiet, watchful contentment, and feels something that she does not try to name precisely, some blend of gratitude and tiredness, and a particular kind of pride too plain and too settled to need any grander word attached to it. Outside, beyond the shuttered window, the last of the true cold has finally, decisively released its hold on the land, and somewhere out in the dark, she knows without needing to check, the first tender green shoots of the new season's wheat are already beginning their own slow, patient rise through the softened earth her husband turned just days before. The goat, whose small stumble of illness back in January had briefly threatened to unravel so much of the household's careful winter arithmetic, stands now in visibly better condition than she has in months, her coat regaining its glossy summer sheen, her appetite fully restored, and Edith finds herself checking on her one last time before bed on this particular quiet evening, resting a hand against the animal's warm flank simply to feel her steady, healthy breathing, a small private gesture of gratitude toward a creature who will never understand exactly how much her continued good health mattered to 4 human lives sharing her modest shelter through the hardest months of the year. Even the hens have begun laying properly again now that the days offer enough light to coax their bodies back into full production, and Edith gathers 2 fresh eggs from their nest on her way back through, warm still in her cupped palm, a small ordinary abundance that would have seemed unremarkable in high summer, and feels, after months of careful rationing, almost luxurious in its ease. She sets them carefully in the basket near the hearth, already planning the particular richness they will add to tomorrow's breakfast, a small anticipated pleasure threaded through the ordinary rhythm of an evening otherwise entirely unremarkable. Beyond the walls of this one small household, the whole village settles into its own version of this same quiet spring evening, chimneys sending up their thin threads of smoke into a sky considerably softer now than the hard, glittering winter sky Edith remembers from the coldest stretch of the season, stars still visible but somehow gentler in their light, less a fierce, distant brilliance and more a warm, familiar scattering overhead. Somewhere across the fields, Simon's repaired roof holds firm against nothing more threatening now than a light spring breeze. Somewhere down the lane, Joan's household settles into its own evening exactly as it has all winter, the whole community's careful, interconnected web of mutual aid and quiet neighbourliness having done, once again, precisely what it was built to do. Edith carries the 2 fresh eggs inside and sets them in their basket, then crosses once more to the hearth for the night's final snoring, the same unhurried familiar motion she has performed on every one of the 100 and some nights since this particular winter began, raking back the soft ash, mounding the living embers beneath their protective grey coat, trusting, as she has trusted every single night across 15 full years in this house, that what she banks carefully now will still be breathing quietly when morning comes, looking for it again. There is nothing left to prove in this small nightly ritual anymore, no anxious edge of uncertainty, the way there might have been in a harder season or a leaner year. It has simply become, by now, one more thread in the long, steady fabric of how this family lives, woven so deeply into the shape of an ordinary evening that Edith performs it almost without noticing she is doing it at all. She checks on Robin once more before turning toward her own bed, gently working the small carved wooden sheep free from his loosened grip and setting it on the shelf beside his sleeping mat, where he will find it again in the morning exactly where he expects it to be. He stirs slightly at her touch but does not wake, murmuring something indistinct that might be a word or might simply be the formless sound of a very tired 8-year-old sinking deeper into untroubled sleep, and Edith smooths his hair back from his forehead for a moment before rising again, careful not to disturb him further. Agnes has already retired behind the hurdle screen by the time Edith checks there next, curled beneath her share of the family's blankets with the particular stillness of someone who fell asleep quickly after a full, satisfying day, the small bundle of herbs she has been steadily mastering all winter tucked. Edith notices with quiet amusement into the crook of one arm, as though she could not quite bear to set the lesson fully aside even for the night. Edith does not disturb this either, only stands for a moment in the soft, uneven firelight, watching her daughter's slow, even breathing, thinking of everything this particular winter has quietly handed forward from one generation to the next, and finding herself, not for the first time this season, unexpectedly moved by the plain, undramatic weight of it. Walter is already settled by the time Edith finally slides in beside him, one arm loosely open in the particular unconscious invitation of a man who has spent 15 years growing used to his wife's warmth arriving beside him each night at roughly this same hour, and she fits herself into the familiar space without needing to think about it, her back against his chest, his arms settling naturally over her side, the two of them arranging themselves into a shape worn comfortable by long repetition, the way water finds and keeps the exact same channel through a riverbed year after year, regardless of how much else about the surrounding landscape might shift and change around it. The cottage settles into its nighttime stillness around them, the fire reduced now to its banked, breathing embers, the goat and hens quiet beyond the shared wall, the whole small structure ticking and settling gently as its timbers respond to the mild evening air, in a way entirely different from the sharp, defensive contractions of the deepest winter cold. Somewhere outside, faint and distant, an owl calls once, twice, and falls silent again, the sound carrying easily across ground no longer muffled by the deep snow that swallowed such noises whole just weeks before. Edith feels sleep approaching now, with its familiar gentle heaviness, and she does not resist it, letting her thoughts loosen and drift the way they always do in these final minutes before it claims her fully. She thinks briefly of spring stretching out ahead of the whole family now, of planting and lambing and the long busy months of growing warmth still to come, and beneath that thought, quieter and more constant, she carries the plain, settled knowledge that whatever the coming seasons ask of this small household, they will meet it the same patient way they have met everything else, together, carefully, one ordinary day at a time. Walter's breathing beside her slows further into the deep, even rhythm of genuine sleep, his arm heavy and warm across her side, and Edith allows her own eyes to close at last, the last waking image drifting through her mind, not any single dramatic scene from the whole long winter now behind them, but simply this, the plainest and truest picture of all, her whole family breathing quietly around her in the dark, safe, fed, warm, and entirely, completely home. Outside, the night deepens slowly over the whole sleeping village, over the frozen memory of a winter already beginning to feel, even to those who lived through every difficult and beautiful hour of it, like something gently receding into the softer distance of memory. The fields Walter turned just days before lie dark and quiet under a sky scattered with stars considerably gentler now than the hard, brilliant winter sky that once watched over this same ground, and somewhere beneath that softened earth, invisible in the darkness, the first pale roots of the new season's wheat continue their slow, patient work, entirely unhurried, entirely certain of their own eventual arrival into the light. The bones some of the older village children bound to their boots for skating across the mill pond's frozen surface now hang forgotten in a corner of somebody's cottage until next winter calls for them again. And the whole bright, shrieking chaos of that particular afternoon, Robin windmilling his arms for balance while the older children glided past him with practiced ease, has already folded itself into the same soft category of memory as the war-sailing torches and the 12th night taper passed hand to hand, small bright moments strung together across the whole long season like beads on a single patient thread. Nearby, the mill pond, no longer solid enough now to bear a child's careful weight, moves again with a faint constant murmur audible if a person happened to stand close enough and listen for it, water finding its way forward, the way it always eventually does once whatever held it still has finally released its grip. The communal oven sits cold and dark at this late hour, waiting for tomorrow's turn among the village's households, and the church, silent now with its congregation long dispersed to their separate beds, holds its own particular kind of stillness within thick stone walls that have witnessed, by now, more winters passing through this same small community than any single living person could accurately count. Not far off, the frozen water trough near the byre, whose bell-like ring Robin reported with such seriousness back on that very first morning of this whole long chronicle, has long since thawed into ordinary stillness and would strike no such note now, even if some passing hand cared to test it with a stick the way it once did. Every household along the lane holds some version of the same quiet scene this family's cottage holds tonight. Fires banked low, bodies settled into whatever warmth the day's careful preparation managed to secure, the whole village breathing together in the dark, the way it has breathed together through every winter stretching back further than memory reaches. One more ordinary night added to an unbroken chain of ordinary nights, each one plain and unremarkable in itself, and yet, taken together, forming the whole quiet, sturdy architecture of a community that simply does not let its own members go unwarmed, unfed, or unwatched over, not through the hardest weeks of the coldest season, and not on any of the many gentler nights that follow after. Hours pass in that particular timeless way that hours always pass over a sleeping household, marked by nothing more than the fire's embers settling a fraction lower, the faint shift of position as Robin turns in his sleep and resettles, one arm now flung wide in a posture that would look, to anyone watching, like the pure unguarded trust of a child who has never once doubted that this small warm room would hold him safely through until morning. Agnes sleeps on in her own steady rhythm, the small herb bundle still cradled loosely in the crook of her arm, dreams moving behind her closed eyes that she will not fully remember by breakfast, some blend perhaps of honey and hives, and her mother's patient voice naming plants in the dark. Somewhere in the deepest hour of the night, the owl calls once more from whatever branch has claimed it for tonight's hunting, and this time nothing in the cottage stirs at all in response. The whole household settled now into that particular deep, unbroken stretch of sleep that arrives only after a long day of honest work and a full measure of contentment, the kind of sleep that asks nothing further of the body or the mind, only rest, complete and undisturbed, for as long as the night cares to grant it. The first hint of grey beginning to soften the eastern sky remains still some hours away, distant enough that nobody in this small cottage need concern themselves with it yet, distant enough that the whole household can continue exactly as it is now, warm and still and entirely at peace, for a good while longer before any of the coming day's small ordinary demands will call them gently back toward waking. There is nowhere else this family needs to be tonight. There is nothing left undone that cannot comfortably wait until morning's proper light. The fire holds. The animals rest easy beyond the shared wall. The whole small architecture of this one household's winter, tested and proven across so many careful months now finally drawing toward their close, simply continues doing, in the deep quiet hours of this particular night, exactly what it has done all along, holding everyone inside it safe and warm and entirely, peacefully asleep. There is one more small thread worth following before this long chronicle finally lets the family rest. A habit of weather reading that Edith's own grandmother passed down through a whole string of half-rhymed sayings, each one tested and retested across so many decades of careful village observation that nobody bothers questioning their reliability anymore, whatever a more scientifically minded observer might eventually make of them. A red sky at evening, the saying goes, promises fair weather to follow, while the same red catching the morning clouds instead warns of a storm still to come. And Edith has found, across 15 years of watching this particular sky above this particular holding, that the old rule holds true with a consistency that continues to surprise her even now. Other signs exist too, quieter and more particular to this one small patch of countryside. Signs Edith reads the way another woman might read a well-loved book, worn familiar through long acquaintance. Smoke that rises straight and true from the cottage's own chimney hole promises settled weather ahead, while smoke that flattens and spreads sideways, pressed down by some invisible weight in the air, warns of rain, or worse, arriving before the day is done. The behavior of the animals offers its own quiet forecast too, the hens seeking shelter earlier than usual, the goat growing restless and unwilling to settle, each small deviation from ordinary behavior read by this household as carefully as any other more formal instrument might be read, and trusted, by long experience, to be every bit as reliable. Robin has begun learning these same signs himself this winter, trailing his mother or father through whichever small daily observation prompts an explanation, and Edith finds a particular satisfaction in watching her son's attention sharpen around exactly this kind of practical, inherited wisdom, the same slow transmission of accumulated knowledge that has shaped every single generation of this family, stretching back further than anyone could accurately trace. He will not remember learning most of it as any single formal lesson, she suspects, the same way she herself cannot point to any one afternoon when her own grandmother's sayings became simply her own private, permanent way of reading the sky. It will simply arrive the way most of the truest knowledge in a household like this one arrives, absorbed rather than taught, inherited rather than instructed, until one day, decades from now perhaps, Robin will find himself glancing at some evening sky and murmuring the same old rhyme to a child of his own without any clear memory of where he first learned it, only the settled, certain knowledge that it has always simply been true. Lent continues its quiet, simplified course through these final weeks, and beyond it, still some weeks off but drawing steadily closer with every lengthening day, waits Easter itself, a feast that will mark, when it finally arrives, not just a return to richer eating after the season's fast, but something closer to a full completion of the whole long cycle this chronicle has followed. Winter's careful endurance giving way at last to spring's full, confident abundance. Edith thinks of it sometimes in these final quiet evenings, allowing herself small anticipatory pleasures, imagining the particular joy of a table finally free from careful rationing, though she does not rush toward that anticipation so eagerly that she forgets to fully inhabit the present season still unfolding around her, each remaining week of this long winter carrying its own quiet worth, regardless of whatever richer abundance waits beyond it. In the weeks that will follow this particular quiet night, though none of the sleeping household knows it yet in any conscious way, the whole rhythm of their lives will continue its slow, steady turn away from winter's careful containment and toward the busier, more expansive demands of the growing season ahead. The wheat Walter and Robin planted together will push up through the softened earth in thin green blades within a fortnight, and the small flock of lambs, 4 of them now with 2 more still expected, will grow steadily sturdier on legs that wobbled so uncertainly just weeks before, until by early summer they will be racing each other across the pasture with a confidence that makes their earlier fragility seem almost impossible to have witnessed firsthand. Joan and Marjorie and Cecily and old Simon, whose roof now holds firm against nothing more than a gentle spring breeze, will each carry their own small piece of this same winter forward into whatever the coming year asks of them, the whole village's fortunes woven together far more closely than any single household's separate walls might suggest from the outside. This is simply how a community like this one endures, not through any single family's isolated strength, but through the accumulated, overlapping strength of every household bound to every other by small daily kindnesses that rarely announce themselves as anything more than ordinary neighborliness, and yet, taken together across a whole hard season, prove themselves indispensable. Agnes's herbal knowledge will continue deepening through the milder months ahead, her mother's patient teaching moving now from dried winter stores to the living plants themselves as they emerge fresh from the thawing ground, an entirely new layer of the same inheritance waiting to be learned. Robin will grow taller still, as children do, filling out the sleeves of last year's summer clothes before the season is very old, and will likely, if this particular pattern of boyhood holds true, find some fresh and entirely unexpected mischief to occupy the long bright evenings that winter's early darkness never permitted him. And Hal, whose family's bees will wake soon enough from their own tightly clustered winter survival to begin their busy work among the first spring blossoms, will very likely find more reasons still to cross paths with Agnes as the warmer months unfold, a slow story neither of them has any need to rush, growing forward at its own unhurried pace the way most good things in this small, patient world are permitted to do. None of this lies within reach of tonight, though. Not yet. Not while the whole household still rests deep in the particular unbroken sleep of a long winter well and finally survived. Tonight there is only this, the fire banked low and holding steady, 4 lives breathing quietly together in the dark, a small warm cottage standing firm against whatever the last cold hours of the retreating season might still care to test it with, and beyond the shuttered window, a whole waiting world beginning, ever so slowly, to turn itself back toward the light. There is a particular kind of ending that a long winter offers, one without any single dramatic threshold to mark its passing, no bell rung, no announcement made, simply a gradual, cumulative softening until one day, looking back, a person realizes the hardest stretch has already been left some distance behind without anyone quite noticing the exact moment it happened. This is how it will be for this family too, this particular winter folding itself gently into memory over the coming weeks, its sharp edges smoothing the way all remembered hardship eventually smooths, until what remains is not the difficulty of it at all, but simply the warmth, the closeness, the 1,000 small ordinary moments of care that carried 4 lives safely through to this exact quiet night. Edith will remember, years from now, long after Robin has grown tall enough to thatch a roof entirely on his own, and Agnes has carried her mother's careful inheritance forward into a household of her own making, the particular texture of this one winter more clearly than most of the ones that came before or after it, not because anything especially remarkable happened within it, but for exactly the opposite reason, because it unfolded so completely as it should have, each careful preparation meeting each season's demand in turn, each small crisis met and resolved before it could grow into anything larger, each ordinary evening by the fire adding its own small, warm brick to the accumulating structure of a family built to last. She will remember the lamb's first wobbling steps, and the snowdrops Walter carried in from the frozen field, and her daughter's small triumphant certainty naming herbs by scent alone in firelight, grown steadily more confident by the week. She will remember Robin's fierce, patient hope for a wooden ring buried in Christmas bread, and the particular sound of ice cracking clean and sharp across the mill pond, and her own husband's rare, unguarded voice wondering aloud whether his son might one day hold the same worn axe handle that 3 generations before him have already held. She will remember all of it the way a person remembers the shape of their own home in the dark, not through any single vivid image, but through the accumulated, wordless certainty of having lived inside it fully, season after season, one careful winter at a time. But that remembering belongs to some future night still many years distant, and has no place disturbing the particular stillness of this one. Tonight the fire simply holds, low and orange beneath its careful blanket of ash, exactly as it has held on every one of the 100 and some nights since this long winter first began, and the 4 people sleeping around it remain, for these last quiet hours before dawn, exactly where they belong, warm, fed, and entirely unaware of how much larger this ordinary night will eventually grow in the soft, forgiving light of memory. The small carved wooden sheep rests exactly where Edith set it on the shelf beside Robin's sleeping mat, waiting patiently for morning, the way it has waited every night since Walter first carved it in those anxious days before the first lamb's uncertain arrival, and somewhere in his sleep Robin's hand drifts briefly toward the empty space where it usually rests before settling again. Some small unconscious habit of comfort that will likely follow him for years yet, long after he has outgrown any real need for a carved toy sheep to see him safely through the night. Somewhere beyond the shuttered window, the last true frost of the season settles briefly over the softened fields, a final gentle test that the new season's wheat will meet without difficulty, roots already reaching deep enough now into the thawed earth to shrug off one more cold night without any real concern. The mill pond continues its faint, constant murmur. The owl, having finished its hunting, has gone quiet somewhere in the dark woods beyond the village boundary. The communal oven, cold now until tomorrow's turn arrives for some other household's bread, holds within its stone walls the memory of every loaf baked there this whole long season, this family's own dark, fragrant loaves among them, and the whole slow, shared rhythm of the village's baking days will resume again tomorrow exactly as it has resumed every single week since long before Edith herself first arrived in this particular corner of the world as a young bride. The church bell, silent now through these deepest hours, waits patient in its tower for whatever hour will next call it to ring, marking time the way it has marked every single day and night of this family's whole shared life together, faithfully, without fail, one steady peal at a time. And in the small stone and timber cottage at the edge of this quiet, sleeping village, nothing more remarkable happens through the remainder of this particular night than exactly what has already happened. 4 lives breathing steadily together in the dark, a fire banked carefully enough to still be alive come morning, a whole small world holding warm and close and entirely at peace against whatever the last thin edge of winter might still, briefly, care to test it with. There is one further small custom worth noting before the story turns back to its final quiet hours, a habit particular to this household rather than the village more broadly, though Edith suspects a version of it exists in most homes if a person cared to look closely enough. Each evening, just before the final smoring of the fire, she takes a moment to name aloud, quietly, almost too quietly for anyone else to hear clearly, 3 small things from the day just past that she is grateful for, a habit her own mother kept before her, and that Edith has continued without ever quite deciding to make it a formal practice, simply feeling, each night, that the day deserves this small closing acknowledgement before it is allowed to end. Tonight the 3 things come easily: Robin's pride at the top of the byre ladder, Agnes's 4 correctly named herbs in a row, the particular softness of the spring air drifting in through the door, left open a moment too long that afternoon, and Edith speaks them into the dying firelight the way she has spoken some version of this same small ritual on nearly every night of this whole long winter, a private closing prayer disguised as nothing more than simple habit. Faith moves through this household the way the fire itself does, present in nearly every corner of daily life without ever needing much separate ceremony to announce itself. A short prayer accompanies the lighting of the morning fire, another the evening's final smearing, small murmured words worn as smooth and familiar through repetition as any of the household's other daily habits, spoken more often from habit than from any conscious effort at devotion, though no less sincerely meant for the ease of their delivery. Robin was given his own name, like most children in this village, for the saint whose feast day fell nearest to his birth, a small quiet link between one ordinary boy and a whole long chain of tradition stretching back further than he has any hope of tracing, and Agnes carries her own name for a similar reason, chosen by a grandmother she never met but whose memory persists, in this small quiet way, every time her name is spoken aloud. There is a comfort in this steady, undramatic faith that suits the whole rhythm of the household well, neither showy nor anxious, simply present, the way the walls themselves are present, holding the family's days in a familiar, trusted shape without requiring constant conscious attention to keep functioning. Edith finds herself on the hardest evenings of the coldest weeks now safely behind them, remembering this steady undercurrent of quiet faith as one more thread among the many that carried this family through, not the loudest or most dramatic of them, but reliable in exactly the same patient, unremarkable way the banked fire itself has proven reliable across every single night of this whole long season. Consider for a moment everything this one ordinary household carried through these long months without ever once treating the carrying as anything extraordinary. A fire kept alive from one evening to the next across a whole season, never once allowed to die out entirely, never once allowed to be wasted either, tended with the same careful attention a person might bring to something considerably more precious than a simple heap of glowing embers beneath grey ash. A larder counted and measured and stretched with such quiet, patient skill that a season capable of genuine hardship passed through this particular home, leaving behind nothing more troubling than the occasional evening of slightly thinner pottage, met without complaint because the family understood, in a way few modern households ever need to learn firsthand, exactly what that careful stretching had bought them. Think, too, of the wool, spun thread by patient thread through months of firelit evenings until it became, by slow accumulation, enough cloth to clothe 4 bodies through another whole year ahead, every inch of it traceable back to a single afternoon's shearing, to a single flock grazing on this same small holding's modest pasture. Consider the animals themselves sharing their warmth and their labour, and in the goat's case her very milk, in exchange for nothing more than careful daily tending, a partnership between species so old and so thoroughly worked out over centuries that neither party involved would think to call it anything so grand as partnership at all, simply the ordinary shape of how a farm survives its hardest season. There is the sheer accumulated patience to consider too, the whole season's worth of it, week after week of small careful choices that individually seemed almost too modest to matter. A slightly smaller portion here, a slightly earlier bedtime there, one more log left unburned tonight, so that 3 more might remain for a colder night still to come. No single one of these small choices carried any real weight on its own. Strung together across a whole long winter, though, they became the entire difference between a household that merely survived the season and one that moved through it with something closer to genuine ease. And Edith has come, across her own 15 winters in this house, to trust that patient accumulation more than she trusts almost any other single principle of how a life like this one ought to be lived. Think of the neighbours too, drifting in and out of each other's lives all winter long, with small gifts of wax and honey and news, mending each other's roofs without being asked, sharing the labour of clearing snow and turning frozen soil, understanding, without ever needing to say it aloud, that no single household in a community like this one truly stands alone against a hard season, that the whole intricate web of mutual small kindnesses is itself a kind of insurance more reliable, in its way, than any stored grain or banked fire could ever manage entirely on its own. And consider, finally, the quieter inheritance passing forward invisibly beneath all of it, a mother's herbal knowledge finding its way into a daughter's steady, careful hands, a father's patient teaching shaping a son's own growing competence one small task at a time, a whole accumulated way of understanding the world, its dangers and its comforts, and its long patient rhythms, handed down not through any single dramatic lesson, but through 1,000 small ordinary moments, exactly like the ones this particular winter offered in such generous supply. There is a particular image Edith keeps returning to in these final quiet moments before the story of this winter finally closes its own door behind it, the image of that single lit taper passed hand to hand around the crowded circle on Twelfth Night, each person holding it only briefly before passing its small steady flame onward to the next waiting palm, none of them keeping it for themselves, all of them trusting the next hand to receive it carefully and keep it burning. That is what a winter like this one asks of a family, she thinks, and what this family once again proved itself entirely capable of giving. Warmth passed carefully from hand to hand, task to task, generation to generation, never hoarded, never wasted, simply kept alive and moving forward exactly as long as it needed to be kept. This is what survived the cold months in this small cottage, every bit as much as the grain in the storage pit, or the wood in the byre. Not just 4 bodies kept warm and fed, though that alone would have been enough. Something larger too, something that does not show itself in any single visible object, passed quietly from one generation to the next, the way warmth itself passes from a banked fire into the cold room around it, invisible in the moment, unmistakable in its lasting effect. That is it. That is the whole world, right there, small and warm and sleeping, exactly as it should be,